I'm about to tell you a story so insane, so unbelievable, that if it were fiction, you'd call it unrealistic. Picture this. It's April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler has just blown his brains out in a bunker beneath Berlin. But upstairs, in the smoking ruins of the German capital, something impossible is happening. A 17-year-old French kid named Jacques is bleeding out in the rubble, clutching a German machine gun. 3 blocks away, a Swedish teenager from neutral Sweden is firing a Panzerfaust at Russian tanks. Around the corner, Dutch boys are dying next to Belgians, Danes fighting alongside Croatians, Spanish volunteers bleeding out next to Ukrainians. 15 different nationalities, 15 different countries, all of them fighting to the death for a man who literally considered them racially inferior. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. This actually happened. These weren't German soldiers. These were foreign volunteers who had traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles to join Hitler's most elite military force, the Waffen SS. And here's the question that's going to haunt you for the next 3 hours. How the hell did we get here? How did 120 German bodyguards, that's it, just 120 men, become nearly 1 million foreign volunteers willing to die for a madman who despised them? The answer is going to shock you, because this isn't just a story about Nazis. It's a story about seduction, manipulation, and how ordinary people become monsters. Let's begin. Heinrich Himmler was a loser. I mean that literally. Failed chicken farmer, rejected from the army, thick glasses, weak chin. But this loser would convince nearly 1 million men to die for him. Picture Heinrich at 22. It's 1922, and he's standing in a muddy field outside Munich, watching his chickens die. Again, his farming venture, funded by his disappointed father, is hemorrhaging money. The chickens keep getting sick. The neighbors think he's an idiot. And Heinrich? Heinrich is seething with humiliation. See, Heinrich had dreams. Big dreams. While other boys his age were chasing girls or learning trades, Heinrich was obsessed with ancient warriors. He devoured stories about Roman legions, Germanic tribes, medieval knights. He'd spend hours sketching elaborate battle plans and imagining himself as some great military leader. There was just one problem. He was terrible at everything. The German army had rejected him during World War I. Too young, they said, though the real reason was written in his medical file: weak constitution, poor eyesight, nervous disposition. While other men his age were dying heroically in the trenches, Heinrich was stuck at home, fantasizing about glory he'd never achieve. The rejection ate at him like acid. So there he was, in 1922, a failed farmer with delusions of grandeur, when he heard about a new political movement, the Nazi Party, and its leader, this Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler, who promised to make Germany great again. Heinrich saw his chance. He joined the party as member number 14,203. Not exactly a founding father, but early enough to matter. He threw himself into party work with the desperate enthusiasm of a man who'd found his purpose. He organized rallies, kept membership lists, did the boring administrative work that more charismatic men avoided. And slowly, very slowly, Hitler began to notice him. In 1929, Hitler made a decision that would change history. He needed someone to run his personal protection unit, the Schutzstaffel, or SS. It was tiny then, maybe 300 men scattered across Germany. Most of the Nazi big shots weren't interested. Too small, too insignificant. But Heinrich was desperate. Hitler called him into his office on January 6, 1929. Heinrich later described it as the most important moment of his life. Hitler looked at this nervous, stammering chicken farmer and said 5 words that would echo through history. "Heinrich, the SS is yours." In that moment, something shifted in Heinrich Himmler's mind. For the first time in his pathetic life, someone important, was trusting him with real power. Not much power, granted. The SS was basically Hitler's personal security detail, about as significant as nightclub bouncers. But to Heinrich, it was everything. He walked out of that meeting with a secret thought burning in his mind. I'll show them all. Heinrich had found his calling, and it wasn't farming. It was empire building. He started small, recruiting men who looked like his fantasy of ancient Germanic warriors. Tall, blonde, physically imposing. Everything Heinrich wasn't. He created elaborate rituals, designed dramatic uniforms, wrote mystical oaths about honor and loyalty. He was building his own personal army, and he was damn good at it. By 1930, Heinrich had grown the SS from 300 men to over 52,000. Still smaller than the SA, the brown-shirted stormtroopers who did the party's dirty work, but growing fast. And Heinrich had big plans. Much bigger than anyone realized. He started talking about the SS as a new elite. Not just bodyguards, but the future leadership of Germany. He told recruits they were joining something ancient and noble, the latest incarnation of elite guards that had protected great leaders throughout history. The Praetorian Guard of Rome, the bodyguards of Caesar, Napoleon's old guard. There has always been a guard, he would tell them, and the guard of the new Germany will be the SS. It was brilliant manipulation. Heinrich was taking ordinary German men, farmers, factory workers, shop clerks, and convincing them they were destined for greatness. He was selling them the same fantasy he'd sold himself, that they were special, chosen, superior. And they believed him because they wanted to believe him. But Heinrich had a problem. His men kept getting killed. See, in the early days of the Nazi movement, political violence was constant. Street fights with communists, brawls with socialists, pitched battles with anyone who opposed the party. The SA thrived in this chaos. They were thugs who enjoyed the violence. But Heinrich's SS men? They were supposed to be elite, disciplined, above the common brawling, which made them targets. Communist fighters would specifically hunt SS men because they represented Nazi leadership. They'd ambush them after rallies, attack them in their homes, sometimes torture them before killing them. Heinrich would get reports almost daily. Another SS man beaten to death in Berlin. Another found shot in Munich. Another disappeared in Hamburg. His elite guard was being picked off, one by one. And that's when Heinrich learned the most important lesson of his life. If you want to build an empire, you can't just recruit followers. You have to create fanatics. Men so devoted to your cause that death becomes irrelevant. Men who believe in something bigger than themselves. Heinrich started refining his recruitment process. He wasn't just looking for strong bodies anymore. He was looking for empty souls, men desperate for purpose, meaning, belonging. Men like himself. Men who would trade everything, even their humanity, for the promise of being special. By 1934, Heinrich had a problem on his hands. But it wasn't the communists anymore. It was success. His SS had grown so large, so powerful, that it was threatening to eclipse the SA. The stormtroopers were getting nervous. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, was talking about revolution, and Hitler was starting to see the SS as his insurance policy. Heinrich sensed an opportunity, a chance to prove that his elite guard was more than just bodyguards. A chance to show that they could be Hitler's executioners. June 30th, 1934. Sepp Dietrich is driving through Munich with a list of names. By sunrise, most of these men will be dead. And Sepp? He's the one pulling the trigger. But let's back up. Because Sepp Dietrich wasn't supposed to be a killer. He was supposed to be a simple working-class hero. Born in 1892 in a tiny Bavarian village, Sepp was everything Heinrich Himmler wasn't. Tall, handsome, charismatic. A genuine war hero who'd earned the Iron Cross fighting in the trenches. When he walked into a room, people noticed. When he spoke, they listened. Hitler loved him instantly. Sepp had joined the Nazi Party early, back when it was still a joke movement in Munich beer halls. He'd organized Hitler's first bodyguard unit, the Stosstrup Adolf Hitler, and had literally taken bullets for the cause. During the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, Sepp had been right there next to Hitler when the shooting started. While other Nazis ran or hid, Sepp stood his ground. By 1934, Sepp commanded the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment. These weren't Heinrich's mystical warriors or political fanatics. They were professional soldiers, men who'd followed Sepp because they trusted him. And now Hitler was asking Sepp to do something that would test that trust forever. The SA had become a problem. Ernst Röhm, their leader, commanded over 400,000 brown-shirted stormtroopers. That was larger than the official German army, and Röhm was getting ideas. Big ideas. He wanted to merge the SA with the regular army and make himself the supreme military commander. He was talking revolution, talking about a second wave of Nazi transformation. Hitler was terrified. Not of Röhm personally. Ernst had been his friend for over a decade. But of what Röhm represented. An independent power base that could challenge Hitler's authority. So Hitler made a choice that would define his regime forever. He decided to kill his friends before they could betray him. The plan was simple and horrifying. SS units would simultaneously strike across Germany arresting and executing SA leaders. They'd claimed the SA was planning a coup, that they were acting to save the Reich. It was Hitler's first great lie, but it wouldn't be his last. And Sepp Dietrich was going to make it happen. On the morning of June 30th, Sepp assembled his men at the Leibstandarte barracks in Munich. He read them the list of names, SA leaders, political rivals, even some old personal enemies Hitler wanted eliminated. Some of these men were Sepp's friends. Men he'd fought beside, drunk with, trusted. But orders were orders. The first target was Edmund Heines, SA leader of Silesia. They found him in bed with a young man at a hotel in Bad Wiessee. Sepp kicked down the door personally, dragged Heines out in his underwear, and shot him in the courtyard. No trial, no questions, just execution. It was that simple. Next was August Schneidhuber, SA chief of Munich. Sepp had known August for years. They'd served together in the early party. August didn't resist when they came for him. He probably thought it was some kind of mistake, that Sepp would protect him. Instead, Sepp put a bullet in his head. All across Germany, similar scenes were playing out. Heinrich's SS men were proving their loyalty in blood. They dragged SA leaders from their homes, from restaurants, from their beds. Some fought back, most didn't. Many still couldn't believe that their own comrades were killing them. But belief was irrelevant. The SS had their orders. The killing went on for 3 days. Hitler had given them a list of 85 names, but the SS exceeded expectations. They killed SA leaders who weren't on the list, settled old grudges, eliminated personal rivals. Once the killing started, it took on a life of its own. Some estimates put the death toll over 1,000. Sepp Dietrich was there for all of it. He personally executed at least 6 men, maybe more. Years later, he would describe it as the most difficult thing he'd ever done. Not because of the killing. Sepp was a soldier he'd killed before. But because of the betrayal. He was murdering men who trusted him. And the worst part? It worked. When the smoke cleared, the SA was finished as an independent force. Röhm himself was dead, shot in his cell by Theodor Eicke, the man who would later command the Totenkopf division. The surviving SA members were either absorbed into other organizations or simply disappeared into civilian life. The brown shirts became a historical footnote. But the SS? The SS emerged as the clear winners. They had proven their absolute loyalty to Hitler by committing mass murder on his command. They had shown they were willing to kill anyone, even their own comrades, if Hitler asked them to. In Heinrich Himmler's mind, they had graduated from bodyguards to enforcers. On July 13th, Hitler addressed the Reichstag and announced that 61 people had been executed. He claimed 13 had died resisting arrest and 3 had committed suicide. The real number was probably 20 times higher. But nobody challenged Hitler's version of events. Who was going to? Anyone who might have spoken up was already dead. For Sepp Dietrich, the night of the long knives was a turning point. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had murdered his friends in cold blood, and he had done it for Adolf Hitler. There was no going back from that. No moral ground left to stand on. Heinrich Himmler watched it all with satisfaction. His SS had passed the ultimate test. They weren't just willing to die for the cause, they were willing to kill for it. To betray their friends, abandon their morals, and commit murder on command. They had become exactly what Heinrich needed them to be. Sepp didn't know it yet, but he'd just sold his soul. And Heinrich Himmler owned the receipt. The SA was dead, but something much more dangerous had taken its place. An organization that would follow orders without question, kill without hesitation, and obey without conscience. Heinrich had created the perfect instrument of terror. Now he just needed to figure out how to use it. What if I told you there was a school where they put live grenades on your helmet? Where tanks drove over your head? Where 85% of students failed, and the failures were the lucky ones? Welcome to Felix Steiner's SS Officer Training Program, the place where Heinrich Himmler's vision of elite warriors became terrifying reality. Felix Steiner wasn't supposed to be a Nazi. Born in 1896 in East Prussia, he was a career Prussian officer, the old-school military aristocracy that looked down on Hitler's movement as crude populism. But the Great War had broken something inside Felix, and the broken pieces didn't fit together the same way. He'd been a young lieutenant in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. 60,000 British casualties in a single day, and Felix had watched it all through his binoculars. Waves of men walking into machine gun fire, falling like wheat before a scythe. The old tactics, the old honor, the old way of war, all of it useless against modern killing machines. Felix came home from the war convinced that everything had changed. Traditional military thinking was dead. Future wars would be won by elite stormtroops, small units of fanatically trained soldiers who could break through enemy lines and wreak havoc behind them. He'd studied the German stormtrooper tactics from 1918, the ones that almost won the war, and he had ideas for improving them. When Heinrich Himmler offered him command of the SS Deutschland Regiment in 1935, Felix saw his chance. Here was an organization with unlimited resources, ambitious goals, and complete freedom from traditional military bureaucracy. He could finally test his theories about creating the perfect soldier. The fact that it was attached to the Nazi Party barely registered. Felix wasn't interested in politics. He was interested in warfare. Felix established his training camp at Dachau, right next to Heinrich's concentration camp. The location wasn't coincidental. Felix wanted his recruits to understand from day one that this wasn't the regular army. This was something darker, more serious, more demanding. The screams from the camp next door served as motivation. Work hard, or you might end up there. The training began at 6 in the morning with physical conditioning that would have killed professional athletes. 20-mile runs in full gear. Obstacle courses, designed by engineers to be nearly impossible. Hand-to-hand combat training where broken bones were considered normal. Felix wasn't just building soldiers. He was breaking down human beings and rebuilding them as weapons. But the physical training was just the beginning. Felix's real innovation was psychological conditioning. He designed exercises specifically to destroy normal human responses to danger and death. Take the grenade drill. Recruits would stand perfectly still, while instructors placed live hand grenades on their helmets. The grenades had 4-second fuses. The recruit's job was to stay motionless until the instructor removed the grenade with 1 second left. Move too early, you fail. Move too late, you die. The margin for error was literally life and death. Then there was the tank exercise. Recruits would lie in shallow foxholes while 30-ton tanks drove directly over them. The clearance was maybe 6 inches. If you panicked, if you tried to get up, the tank would crush you. Felix lost at least 3 recruits this way, maybe more. He considered it acceptable casualties. Karl Brenner was 19 when he arrived at Dachau in 1937. Son of a Munich shopkeeper, he joined the SS because his girlfriend thought the black uniform looked handsome. Within a week, he was questioning everything he'd ever believed about himself. The first time they made Karl lie under the tank, he vomited from fear. The instructor, an SS sergeant named Müller, laughed and called him a coward. Then Müller made Karl clean up his own vomit and try again. And again, and again, until Karl could lie motionless, while 30 tons of steel passed inches from his face. The first time, I thought I was going to die, Karl would write in his diary. The 10th time, I stopped caring if I died. The 20th time, I realized I was already dead inside. That was exactly what Felix wanted. He wasn't just teaching his recruits to follow orders. He was teaching them to abandon their humanity, to become so disconnected from normal human emotion that killing would be as natural as breathing. The live ammunition exercises were the final test. Recruits would assault mock enemy positions while instructors fired real bullets over their heads. The bullets were supposed to miss by 3 feet. Sometimes they missed by less. Sometimes they didn't miss at all. Heinrich Müller, not the sergeant, but a recruit from Hamburg, caught a bullet in the shoulder during his final exercise. As he lay bleeding in the dirt, the instructor stood over him and asked, "What do you do when you're wounded in combat?" Heinrich, delirious with pain, gasped out the correct answer, "Complete the mission." So they made him crawl the remaining 100 meters to the objective before they called for a medic. Heinrich lived, but the bullet shattered his collarbone. He never regained full use of his left arm. Felix considered this a success story. Heinrich had proven he would follow orders even while dying. That made him the perfect SS officer. The psychological manipulation went deeper than just physical courage. Felix had studied the techniques used by religious cults and revolutionary movements. He understood how to break down individual identity and replace it with group loyalty. Recruits were forbidden to use their first names. They became numbers, ranks, functions. Their personal histories were erased and replaced with SS mythology. They weren't Karl from Munich or Heinrich from Hamburg anymore. They were warriors in an ancient brotherhood, the latest link in a chain stretching back to Germanic tribes and Roman legions. Felix would lecture them for hours about their racial superiority, their historical destiny, their sacred duty to protect the German people from their enemies. But the real indoctrination wasn't in the lectures. It was in the shared suffering. When you've survived hell together, when you've watched your comrades die and kept going, you'll believe anything that gives meaning to that sacrifice. By 1939, Felix had refined his process into a precision instrument. He could take any reasonably fit German male and, in 6 months, transform him into a fanatical killing machine. The failure rate had dropped from 85% to 60%. Still brutal but efficient enough for Heinrich's purposes. The graduates of Felix's program went on to become the core leadership of the Waffen SS. Kurt Meyer, who would command the Hitler Youth Division. Fritz Witt, who would die leading teenagers in Normandy. Otto Kumm, who would survive the war to become a successful businessman. All of them products of Felix's perfect soldier factory. But Felix had created something he couldn't control. His graduates weren't just elite soldiers. They were men who had been systematically stripped of normal human empathy and moral restraint. They could fight with incredible courage and skill, but they could also commit atrocities without hesitation. Because Felix hadn't just taught them to kill enemies. He taught them to kill conscience. The dark truth that Felix never admitted, even to himself, was simple. He wasn't creating soldiers. He was creating killers. Men who would follow any order, commit any crime, betray any principle if their superiors demanded it. And Heinrich Himmler couldn't have been happier, because that's exactly what he needed for the next phase of his plan. Picture this. Your 10-year-old comes home from school excited about weekend camping. Except the camping involves learning to kill. And it's mandatory. This is the story of how Heinrich Himmler weaponized an entire generation of children. And it starts with the most unlikely Nazi of all, a man with American blood in his veins. Baldur von Schirach was a walking contradiction. Born in Berlin in 1907 to a German father and an American mother, he should have been a symbol of international friendship. His great-grandfather had been a Union officer in the American Civil War fighting to free the slaves. Instead, Baldur became Hitler's Minister of Youth, the man who turned 7.7 million German children into Nazis. The irony was lost on nobody except Baldur himself. He genuinely believed he was saving Germany's youth from moral corruption and political chaos. He saw himself as a youth leader, not a propaganda minister. The fact that he was systematically destroying the moral foundation of an entire generation never occurred to him. Or if it did, he buried it so deep that even he couldn't find it. When Hitler appointed Baldur as Reich Youth Leader in 1933, Germany had dozens of youth organizations. Boy Scouts, church groups, sports clubs, political societies, a rich ecosystem of childhood activities. Within 2 years, Baldur had destroyed all of them. Not reformed them, not coordinated them. Destroyed them. The process was methodical and ruthless. First, Baldur's Hitler Youth groups would infiltrate existing organizations, recruiting members, and spreading Nazi ideology. Then they would engineer conflicts, accuse the leadership of disloyalty, and demand government investigation. Finally, the organizations would be disbanded and their members forcibly transferred to the Hitler Youth. Resistance was met with violence. Hans Weber was 12 when his local Boy Scout troop was absorbed into the Hitler Youth in 1934. He'd loved scouting, the camping trips, the merit badges, the sense of adventure, he assumed the Hitler Youth would be similar. He was wrong. Where scouting had emphasized outdoor skills and character development, the Hitler Youth focused on political indoctrination and military training. Instead of learning to tie knots, Hans learned to identify Jewish features. Instead of camping trips, he attended rallies where thousands of children chanted Nazi slogans. Instead of helping old ladies cross the street, he was taught to report neighbors who criticized the government. The transformation was gradual but relentless. At first, Hans's parents thought it was harmless patriotic education. Their son was learning German history, staying physically fit, developing leadership skills. But slowly, they began to notice changes. Hans stopped going to church, claiming it was for weak people. He began correcting his parents when they expressed political opinions that contradicted what he'd learned in the Hitler Youth. He started asking pointed questions about his mother's Jewish friend from work. By 1937, Hans was a stranger in his own home. It was like losing a child to a cult, his mother would later write. Except the cult was run by the government, and you couldn't escape it. Balder's genius lay in understanding child psychology. He knew that children crave belonging, adventure, and the approval of authority figures. So he gave them all three, wrapped in Nazi ideology. The Hitler Youth offered elaborate uniforms that made children feel important. Exciting activities like marching, camping, and weapons training. A clear hierarchy where loyalty was rewarded with promotion and responsibility. Most importantly, it offered children a chance to rebel against their parents while feeling virtuous about it. The weekly meetings were carefully designed to reinforce group identity and political indoctrination. Children would gather in uniform, salute the Nazi flag, and recite oaths of loyalty to Hitler. Then they would participate in activities that gradually normalized violence and hatred. A typical meeting might include physical training designed to prepare boys for military service, map reading and compass work, but focused on potential invasion routes into Germany. First aid training, but with emphasis on battlefield medicine. Even the games were militarized. Capture the flag became simulated combat. Hide and seek became reconnaissance training. For girls, the activities were different, but equally manipulative. The League of German Maidens taught domestic skills, but always in the context of supporting the war effort. Cooking became lessons about nutrition for soldiers. Sewing became making uniforms. Childcare became preparation for producing future warriors for the Reich. But the real indoctrination happened during the camping trips. Away from parents, surrounded by peers, children were subjected to intensive propaganda sessions disguised as entertainment. Around the campfire, youth leaders would tell stories about German heroes who died fighting foreign enemies. They would sing songs about blood and soil and racial purity. They would play games where children took turns being Jewish caricatures who were hunted by brave German patriots. It was systematic dehumanization presented as fun. Greta Mueller was 14 when she attended her first Hitler Youth summer camp in 1936. She was excited, 2 weeks in the Bavarian mountains with her friends, hiking and swimming and staying up late. What she experienced was psychological warfare disguised as recreation. The first night, the camp leader gathered all the girls around a bonfire and told them a story about a German village that had been corrupted by Jewish influence. How the Jewish families had grown rich while honest Germans suffered. How Jewish children were taught to hate and exploit their German neighbors. How brave German patriots had finally expelled the Jews and restored purity to their community. Then the camp leader asked the girls to imagine what it would feel like to cleanse their own communities of such corruption, to protect their families and their race from contamination, to be heroes in the great struggle for German survival. The girls, caught up in the emotion of the moment, enthusiastically agreed that they would do whatever was necessary. Greta later described it as the moment she stopped being herself and became part of something larger and more terrible. "I felt like I was joining a sacred mission," she wrote. "I didn't understand that the mission was evil." By 1939, Baldur von Schirach controlled the minds of 7.7 million German children. Every boy and girl between the ages of 10 and 18 was required to join the Hitler Youth. Resistance was met with fines, imprisonment, or worse. Parents who tried to protect their children were labeled enemies of the state. The results were everything Heinrich Himmler had hoped for. When the war began, the SS had an unlimited supply of young recruits who had been psychologically prepared for fanaticism from childhood. Boys who had spent years learning that violence was noble, that obedience was sacred, that certain groups of people weren't really human. Hans Weber, that 12-year-old Boy Scout, volunteered for the Waffen SS on his 18th birthday in 1940. He served with the Hitler Youth Division in Normandy, where he was killed fighting Canadian troops 3 days after day. His last letter home praised Hitler and expressed regret that he couldn't kill more enemies of the Reich. His parents never got their son back. Greta Müller became a concentration camp guard at Ravensbrück, where she supervised the execution of thousands of women and children. After the war, she claimed she was only following orders and had never understood what she was doing. She may have been telling the truth. The indoctrination had been that complete. This was Heinrich Himmler's greatest victory and most terrible crime. He hadn't just recruited soldiers. He had stolen the souls of an entire generation. He had taken children who should have grown up to be doctors, teachers, parents, and productive citizens and turned them into instruments of genocide. By 1939, Heinrich owned 7.7 million young minds. Minds that had been systematically emptied of compassion, critical thinking, and moral restraint. Minds that were ready to follow any order, commit any crime, and die for any cause their leaders demanded. The perfect raw material for his international army of fanatics. All he needed now was a war to test them. September 1939. A small Polish town. 50 Jewish men are forced into a synagogue. What happens next will shock you, not because it's unexpected, but because of who ordered it. Lieutenant Klaus Weber had been Felix Steiner's star pupil. 22 years old, perfect physical specimen, flawless academic record. He'd survived the tank exercises, the live grenade drills, the psychological conditioning. He was everything Heinrich Himmler had dreamed of, the new Germanic warrior, ready to lead Germany into its glorious future. Klaus commanded a platoon in the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler as they rolled into Poland on September 1st. It was supposed to be a military campaign, clean and professional. Defeat the Polish army, occupy the territory, establish German control. Klaus expected to fight soldiers, capture strategic objectives, maybe win some medals. He had no idea he was about to become a mass murderer. The town of Błony was nothing special. Maybe 8,000 people, mostly farmers and shopkeepers. The Polish army had already retreated, leaving behind a few scattered weapons and a lot of frightened civilians. Klaus's orders were simple: secure the town, establish control, await further instructions. But on September 7th, Klaus received new orders that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Orders that came directly from Heinrich Himmler's headquarters in Berlin. All Jewish males between 16 and 60 are to be assembled for questioning regarding partisan activities. Klaus read the order 3 times. It didn't make sense. There were no partisans in Błony. The town had surrendered without resistance. But orders were orders, and Klaus had been trained to follow them without question. His men went house to house, pulling Jewish men from their families. Fathers, sons, grandfathers. Some were respected members of the community: the town doctor, a successful merchant, a school teacher. Others were simple laborers who had never hurt anyone in their lives. All of them were terrified. They assembled 53 men in the town square. Klaus stood before them in his pristine SS uniform, looking every inch the perfect German officer. But inside, something was beginning to crack. These weren't enemy soldiers. They were civilians. Scared, confused civilians who had no idea why they were being arrested. That's when Klaus received his second order. This one came by radio directly from SS Oberfuhrer Sepp Dietrich himself. Transport the prisoners to the synagogue for intensive interrogation. Klaus marched the 53 men to the wooden synagogue on the edge of town. It was a small building, maybe designed for 100 worshippers. Cramming 53 prisoners inside left barely room to breathe. Klaus posted guards at the doors and waited for his interrogation team to arrive. But no interrogation team came. Instead, at 4 p.m, Klaus received his final order. The one that would destroy his soul. The Jewish conspirators have been found guilty of partisan activities. Sentenced to be carried out immediately. No survivors. Klaus stared at the radio message for a full minute. This couldn't be real. There had been no trial, no evidence, no investigation. These men were guilty of nothing except being Jewish in occupied Poland. But the order was clear, and it came from the highest levels of SS command. Klaus later wrote in his diary, a diary that would be discovered after the war, about what happened next. His words are almost impossible to read, not because of the handwriting, but because of what they describe. I gathered my men and explained the situation. Some looked shocked, others excited. Sergeant Müller asked if we were really going to kill civilians. I told him we were following orders. Orders from the Reich. Orders that could not be questioned. They surrounded the synagogue with machine guns. Klaus could hear the prisoners inside, praying in Hebrew, crying, calling out to God for salvation. Some were probably praying for their families, others for their own souls. Klaus was praying too, praying that someone would countermand the order, that a higher authority would intervene, that he wouldn't have to do this. But no salvation came. At 4:30, Klaus gave the order to open fire. The machine guns roared for maybe 30 seconds. When the shooting stopped, the synagogue was silent. 53 men were dead, their blood soaking into the wooden floor where generations of their ancestors had worshipped. Klaus's diary entry continues. I expected to feel something. Guilt, horror, shame. Instead, I felt nothing. It was as if my soul had simply shut down to protect itself. I looked at the bodies and felt no more emotion than if they had been sacks of grain. But Klaus wasn't the only SS officer who received such orders that day. Across occupied Poland, similar scenes were playing out. SS units were rounding up Jewish civilians, accusing them of non-existent crimes, and executing them en masse. It was systematic, coordinated, and absolutely deliberate. Most officers followed their orders without question, but not all of them. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hosenfeld was serving with an SS police battalion near Warsaw when he received similar orders. Like Klaus, he was young, well-trained, and fanatically loyal to the Reich. Unlike Klaus, he refused to carry them out. Wilhelm read his orders: execute 30 Jewish civilians suspected of partisan activities, and made a decision that would cost him everything. He reported to his commanding officer that he could find no evidence of partisan activity and requested permission to release the prisoners. His commander, SS Sturmbannführer Hans Kruger, was furious. These are not prisoners, they are enemies of the Reich, Kruger shouted. You will carry out your orders immediately. Wilhelm stood at attention and gave the reply that would define his character. Sir, I joined the SS to serve Germany, not to murder civilians. I request permission to be relieved of this duty. The court-martial was held 3 days later. Wilhelm was charged with disobeying direct orders, undermining military discipline, and showing mercy to enemies of the Reich. The prosecution demanded the death penalty. Wilhelm's defense was simple. I am a soldier, not an executioner. The verdict was guilty on all charges. But something unexpected happened. The presiding judge, an older SS officer who had served in the First World War, commuted the death sentence to 10 years in prison. His written justification cited youthful enthusiasm and misguided moral scruples as mitigating factors. Wilhelm spent the war in military prison while his former comrades committed genocide across Eastern Europe. He was one of maybe a dozen SS officers who refused to participate in mass murder. Out of hundreds of thousands. Klaus Weber, meanwhile, continued his service with distinction. He was promoted twice, awarded the Iron Cross, and eventually commanded a company in the Das Reich Division. He participated in dozens of similar massacres across Poland, and later in the Soviet Union. His superiors praised his efficiency and dedication. After the war, Klaus was captured by Allied forces and charged with war crimes. His defense attorney argued that he was only following orders, that he had no choice, that he was a victim of the system. Klaus himself seemed to believe this. In his final diary entry, written the night before his execution. He wrote, "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to serve my country." But the truth was more complex and more damning. Klaus had choices. Wilhelm Hosenfeld proved that. The difference wasn't circumstance or training or orders. The difference was character. And Heinrich Himmler's system had successfully destroyed the character of nearly everyone who passed through it. The massacre at Błony was just the beginning. Poland was where the SS learned that they could commit any atrocity and face no consequences. Where they discovered that their training had worked perfectly, they could follow any order, no matter how monstrous. Where they realized there was no going back. Because once you've murdered 53 innocent people and felt nothing, you've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. You've become something that isn't quite human anymore. You've become exactly what Heinrich Himmler wanted you to become. There was no going back after Poland. The SS had tasted blood, and they liked it. They called it the phony war. But for 97 British prisoners at La Paradis, there was nothing phony about what happened next. May 27th, 1940. The German blitzkrieg had shattered French resistance and was driving British forces toward the sea. Near the village of La Paradis, a small group of British soldiers from the Royal Norfolk Regiment had taken refuge in a farmhouse. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. But they were still fighting. Leading the attack against them was SS Obersturmführer Fritz Knöchlein. 35 years old, former schoolteacher, family man with 2 young children back in Bavaria. Before the war, Fritz had taught mathematics to teenagers, helped them with their homework, attended parent-teacher conferences. Now he was commanding the 3rd Company of the SS Totenkopf Division, and he was about to commit mass murder. How does a math teacher become a killer? The answer lies in Fritz's journey through Heinrich Himmler's system. Fritz had joined the Nazi Party in 1932, not out of political conviction, but out of career necessity. Teachers who weren't party members found themselves unemployed. When Himmler began recruiting for the SS, Fritz saw an opportunity for advancement. The SS offered better pay, prestige, and the chance to be part of something important. Fritz attended the SS officer school at Bad Tölz, where he underwent Felix Steiner's brutal training regimen. The tank exercises, the live ammunition drills, the psychological conditioning. When he emerged 6 months later, Fritz was no longer a schoolteacher. He was a weapon, in human form. His first assignment was at Dachau concentration camp, where he served under Theodor Eicke's command. Eicke, the man who had personally murdered Ernst Röhm during the Night of the Long Knives, was now in charge of Germany's expanding camp system. He took a special interest in Fritz, recognizing a kindred spirit. The key, Eicke told Fritz during one of their conversations, is to stop seeing them as human. They're not people, they're problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. Fritz took this lesson to heart. When the war began, Fritz's unit was transferred from Dachau to the front lines. They fought in Poland, where Fritz participated in several civilian massacres. Then came the Western Campaign, where Fritz expected to face professional soldiers in conventional warfare. He was looking forward to it. Real combat seemed cleaner than murdering civilians. But the British soldiers in the La Paradis farmhouse refused to surrender easily. They had fought all day, inflicting casualties on Fritz's company and slowing the German advance. Fritz was frustrated, angry, and behind schedule. When he finally overran their position, he was in no mood for mercy. The British soldiers came out with their hands up. 97 men, many wounded, all exhausted. They had fought bravely and deserved to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Instead, Fritz ordered them march to a nearby barn. Private Albert Pooley was among the prisoners. 21 years old, from Norfolk, he'd been wounded in the leg during the fighting. As the Germans herded them toward the barn, Albert noticed something that made his blood run cold. 2 machine guns were being set up facing the barn wall. "They're going to shoot us," Albert whispered to his mate, Private Bill O'Callaghan. Bill, a veteran of the First World War, shook his head. "They can't. We're prisoners. There are rules." But there were no rules in Fritz Knochlein's war. Fritz positioned his men and gave the order personally. "Fire." The machine guns opened up, cutting down the British prisoners like wheat. Men screamed, fell, died. Some tried to run, others begged for mercy. Fritz watched it all with the same detachment he'd once shown grading math papers. Albert Pooley was hit in the leg and stomach, but managed to fall behind a pile of bodies. He lay perfectly still as German soldiers walked among the corpses, shooting anyone who showed signs of life. A boot stepped on his back. A rifle barrel pressed against his head. But somehow, the German soldier didn't notice he was still breathing. Bill O'Callaghan had also survived, wounded but alive beneath the pile of his dead comrades. The 2 men lay motionless for hours, listening to the Germans searching the area, occasionally shooting another wounded prisoner who moaned too loudly. When darkness fell, Albert and Bill crawled out from under the bodies. 95 of their comrades were dead. The 2 survivors stumbled through the French countryside for 3 days before reaching French lines. They were the only witnesses to Fritz Knochlein's war crime. But here's the shocking part. When Albert and Bill reported the massacre to British authorities, nobody believed them. The official response was dismissive. German soldiers were professionals, the reports claimed. They didn't murder prisoners. The 2 survivors must be confused, traumatized, possibly lying to avoid court-martial for abandoning their positions. Albert and Bill were interrogated more harshly than Fritz would be after the war. This response wasn't unique to the La Paradis case. Throughout the Western campaign, reports of SS atrocities were systematically ignored or suppressed. The British and French governments didn't want to believe that their enemies were capable of such barbarism. It didn't fit their understanding of civilized warfare. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Fritz Knochlein was being celebrated as a hero. His superiors praised his aggressive leadership and battlefield effectiveness. Heinrich Himmler personally awarded him the Iron Cross for his service in France. The massacre at La Paradis wasn't seen as a crime. It was seen as evidence of proper SS spirit. The German victory in France had intoxicating effects on the SS leadership. They had defeated armies that had fought Germany to a standstill in the previous war. Their tactics worked, their training was superior, their racial theories seemed validated by success. If they were this dominant against professional European armies, imagine what they could accomplish against inferior peoples in the East. This is how victory became a mask for horror. The spectacular German success in France convinced the world that the Wehrmacht was a professional, disciplined military force. Newsreels showed smiling German soldiers sharing cigarettes with captured British troops. Newspapers praised the correct behavior of German forces towards civilians. Even Winston Churchill grudgingly admitted that the German army had fought according to the rules of war. But behind the propaganda, a different story was emerging. SS units had murdered prisoners at La Paradis, Le Quesnoy, and dozens of other locations. They had executed French civilians suspected of resistance activity. They had begun implementing racial policies that classified certain populations as subhuman. France was their testing ground for techniques they would later perfect in Eastern Europe. Fritz Knochlein went on to serve with distinction on the Eastern Front. He commanded increasingly larger units, earned more decorations, and participated in countless atrocities. The massacre at La Paradis had been his graduation ceremony into the ranks of professional killers. Everything that came after was just practice. After the war, Fritz was finally brought to trial for the La Paradis massacre. Albert Pooley and Bill O'Callaghan, now in their 50s, testified against him. Their memories were perfect, their testimony devastating. Fritz was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. His final statement to the court was revealing. "I was a good soldier following orders. I did my duty to the fatherland. I have no regrets." Even facing execution, Fritz couldn't acknowledge that murdering prisoners was wrong. Himmler's conditioning had been that complete. Fritz Knochlein was hanged on January 28, 1948. But by then the damage was done. The SS had learned that they could commit atrocities and face no immediate consequences. That victory could mask any crime, that the world would look the other way as long as they kept winning. France was just practice for what was coming, a dress rehearsal for the real show. Because in exactly 1 year, Heinrich Himmler's perfectly trained killers would cross into the Soviet Union. And there, with no witnesses and no limits, they would show the world what they really were. June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Across a 1,500-mile front, 3 million men cross into the Soviet Union. Among them, Hitler's elite SS divisions. They think they're going to war. They have no idea they're about to become the world's most efficient killers. Sturmbannführer Heinrich Springer commanded a battalion in the Das Reich division as it rolled across the Soviet border. 28 years old, former Hitler youth leader, veteran of Poland and France. He kept a detailed diary throughout the campaign, a diary that would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence about SS war crimes. Because Heinrich wrote down everything. His first entry, dated June 22nd, is almost innocent. Crossed the Soviet border at 0400 hours. No resistance encountered. Weather clear, morale excellent. The men are eager to prove themselves against the Bolshevik enemy. Heinrich had every reason to be confident. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in human history. 150 German divisions, supported by Finnish, Romanian, and Hungarian allies. The Wehrmacht had never lost a campaign. Soviet resistance was expected to collapse within weeks. But Heinrich's division wasn't just there to fight soldiers. They had received special orders, issued directly from Hitler's headquarters. Orders that would transform them from warriors into genocidal killers. The first was the Commissar Order. Any captured Soviet political officers were to be executed immediately. No trials, no prisoners, no mercy. The justification was that commissars weren't real soldiers but political fanatics who would never surrender or cooperate. The reality was that Hitler wanted to decapitate Soviet leadership at every level. Heinrich's diary entry for June 25th describes his first encounter with this order. Captured a Soviet position today. Found one commissar among the prisoners. Young man, maybe 25, spoke German. Tried to surrender properly, hands up, no weapons. I shot him in the head as ordered. Strange how easy it was. Like shooting a rabbit. The second order was even more sinister. German soldiers would not be held responsible for crimes against Soviet civilians. The normal rules of military justice were suspended. Soldiers could rape, murder, and pillage without fear of court-martial. The only requirement was that such actions serve the broader goal of terrorizing the population into submission. Heinrich's battalion first tested these new rules on June 28th, when they occupied the town of Minsk. The Soviet army had already retreated, leaving behind a population of terrified civilians. Most were Belarusians, some were Jews, all were now at the mercy of Heinrich's men. The men needed to blow off steam after the fighting, Heinrich wrote. I authorized recreational activities in the Jewish quarter. No specific orders given, but the men understood what was expected. What followed was a 3-day orgy of violence that shocked even some SS veterans. Homes were looted and burned. Women were raped and murdered. Children were shot for sport. The local synagogue was packed with elderly Jews and set on fire. Those who tried to escape were machine-gunned. Heinrich documented it all with clinical detachment. Eliminated approximately 200 Jewish partisans today. Morale remains high. The men are adapting well to Eastern conditions. But the most damning evidence in Heinrich's diary isn't the descriptions of atrocities. It's how quickly he stopped seeing them as atrocities. By July, Heinrich was writing about mass murder the same way he'd once written about training exercises. Processed 400 civilians in the forest outside Smolensk. Efficient operation, completed in 2 hours. Recommend this location for future actions. Processed. That's how Heinrich referred to murdering 400 innocent people, as if they were paperwork to be filed. The psychological transformation wasn't unique to Heinrich. Across the Eastern Front, SS units were discovering that they could commit any atrocity without consequences. More than that, atrocities were rewarded. Officers who showed proper hardness towards civilians received promotions and decorations. Those who showed mercy were transferred to less important positions. The system was creating monsters with terrifying efficiency. Young men who had entered the Soviet Union with some vestige of human decency were being systematically corrupted. Not through force or coercion, but through permission. Permission to indulge their darkest impulses without consequences. Take the case of Unterscharführer Werner Kloss. 20 years old, son of a Lutheran minister from Württemberg. Werner had joined the SS against his father's wishes, seduced by promises of adventure and brotherhood. His letters home during the first weeks of Barbarossa were innocent, even childish. "Dear Mother," he wrote on June 30th, "we are advancing so fast the maps can't keep up. The countryside is beautiful, like a fairy tale. The people here are very primitive, but seem harmless enough. I hope to be home for Christmas, with many stories to tell." But Werner's unit was assigned to anti-partisan operations behind the front lines. In practice, this meant rounding up Jews and communist officials for execution. Werner's first killing was a teenage boy accused of being a partisan messenger. "I couldn't do it at first," Werner confided to his diary. "My hands were shaking too badly to aim. Sergeant Mueller had to steady the rifle for me. Afterward, I vomited for an hour. But Mueller said it gets easier." He was right. Werner's letters home stopped mentioning Christmas. They stopped mentioning anything personal at all. By August, they read like military reports, operations proceeding successfully, enemy resistance decreasing, morale remains high. What Werner couldn't write home was the truth, that he had personally killed over 40 civilians, that he had participated in the systematic extermination of entire villages, that he had become something his mother wouldn't recognize. The numbers were staggering. By the end of 1941, SS units operating behind the front had murdered over 500,000 Soviet civilians. Not soldiers, not partisans, but ordinary people whose only crime was living in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the killing wasn't random or chaotic. It was systematic, organized, efficient. Heinrich Himmler had deployed special units called Einsatzgruppen alongside the regular SS divisions. Their mission was to eliminate Jewish and communist populations in occupied territories. They operated with the full cooperation and support of frontline SS units like Heinrich's battalion. The collaboration between military and extermination units was seamless. SS combat troops would secure an area and round up civilians. Einsatzgruppen specialists would handle the actual killing. Local SS commanders would provide logistical support and security. Everyone had a role, everyone was complicit. Heinrich's diary entry for September 15th captures this collaboration perfectly. "Worked with Einsatzgruppe B today to clear remaining Jewish population from Vitebsk. My men provided outer security, while the specialists handled the technical aspects. Very professional operation. Completed in one day with minimal complications." Technical aspects. Minimal complications. Heinrich was describing the murder of 8,000 people, including children and elderly, as if it were a construction project. This was Heinrich Himmler's greatest achievement and most terrible crime. He had created a military force that could commit genocide while maintaining the fiction that they were professional soldiers. They wore uniforms, followed military protocols, even earned legitimate combat decorations. But underneath the martial facade, they were an extermination machine. The revelation that haunts historians is how easily ordinary young men adapted to mass murder. Werner Kloss, Heinrich Springer, thousands of others, they weren't psychopaths or sadists. They were normal people who had been placed in abnormal circumstances and given permission to become monsters. And they embraced that permission with enthusiasm. By winter, the military situation had deteriorated dramatically. The Soviet army hadn't collapsed as predicted. German forces were stalled outside Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. Casualties were mounting, supplies were running low, and the easy victories were over. But the killing continued. If anything, it accelerated. As military success became more elusive, the SS doubled down on their racial mission. They couldn't defeat the Red Army, but they could exterminate Jewish civilians. They couldn't capture Moscow, but they could burn Ukrainian villages. Heinrich's final diary entry before his death in January 1942 is perhaps the most chilling of all. We may not win this war in the conventional sense, but we have accomplished something far more important. We have proven that the German race is capable of any sacrifice, any action necessary for survival. Future generations will thank us for our hardness. Heinrich died believing he was a hero, a martyr for the cause of German racial purity. The idea that he was actually a mass murderer never occurred to him. Himmler's indoctrination had been that complete. Barbarossa was the point of no return for the SS. In 6 months, they had crossed every moral boundary, violated every rule of civilized warfare, and committed crimes that would echo through history. They had become something new in human experience, an organization that combined military efficiency with genocidal purpose. And the most terrifying part? They were just getting started. Imagine you're 19 years old, freezing in a Russian forest, watching your friends die of frostbite. Your equipment doesn't work. Your officers are dead. And you're starting to realize you're not the master race. You're just meat for the grinder. This is the story of how invincibility died in the snow outside Moscow, and how that death made the SS even more dangerous. Unterscharführer Hans Becker was part of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler when winter hit the Eastern Front like a sledgehammer. 21 years old, former Hitler youth leader, veteran of Poland and France. Hans had never doubted German superiority until December 1941. Then, reality came calling. The German army wasn't prepared for Russian winter. That sounds impossible. How do you invade Russia without winter clothing? But Hitler had promised the campaign would be over by autumn. German planners allocated more resources to victory parades than winter uniforms. It was the kind of arrogance that kills armies. Hans's first taste of Russian winter came on December 6th, when temperatures dropped to -30 Celsius. His unit was dug in outside Moscow, maybe 20 miles from the Kremlin. So close they could see the city's lights at night. But they might as well have been on the moon. The cold is beyond description, Hans wrote in a letter that would never be sent home. It hurts to breathe. Metal burns your skin if you touch it. Our rifles freeze solid. Yesterday, Muller's fingers stuck to his machine gun trigger. We had to pour hot water on them to get him free. He lost 3 fingertips to frostbite. But the cold was just the beginning. On December 6th, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh troops from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare, supported by tanks that actually worked in sub-zero temperatures. The German army, stretched thin, frozen, and exhausted, began to collapse. Hans's unit found itself surrounded by Soviet forces near the town of Klin. For 3 weeks they held a shrinking perimeter against constant attacks. No reinforcements came. No resupply reached them. They ate their horses, then their leather belts, then nothing at all. We started with 200 men, Hans wrote. After 1 week, maybe 150 were still effective. After 2 weeks, 60. Not all killed by enemy fire. Frostbite, starvation, disease. Some just wandered off into the forest and were never seen again. I think they wanted to die somewhere quiet. The psychological impact was worse than the physical suffering. Hans and his comrades had been raised to believe they were racially superior warriors destined to rule Europe. Felix Steiner's training had convinced them they were invincible. Now they were hiding in holes, begging for scraps of food, dying of diseases that wouldn't exist in a civilized army. "We're not supermen," Hans wrote in his final letter attempt. "We're not even soldiers anymore. We're animals fighting over frozen corpses for something to eat. The Russians aren't inferior. They're beating us. They're beating us easily." But here's what makes this story truly dark. As the SS suffered, as their illusions of superiority crumbled, they didn't become more humane. They became more vicious. Trapped, starving, and facing annihilation, Hans's unit did something that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. They began executing their own wounded. Men too injured to retreat, too sick to fight, were shot by their comrades to prevent capture. The official justification was preventing intelligence leaks. The reality was that desperation had stripped away their last vestige of humanity. Hans participated in these killings. His diary describes them in flat, emotionless language. Oberscharführer Weber broke his leg during the Soviet artillery barrage. Could not march with the unit. Disposed of as per standing orders. Weber understood the necessity. Weber understood the necessity. Hans had just murdered his own sergeant, a man he'd served with for 2 years, and described it like filing a report. The brutalization went beyond killing their own wounded. SS units began systematically murdering Soviet prisoners to conserve food and eliminate security risks. They burned villages to deny shelter to pursuing forces, leaving civilian populations to freeze to death. They executed captured commissars with increasing sadism, as if inflicting pain could somehow restore their sense of power. A Soviet officer named Captain Alexei Petrov was captured by Hans's unit on December 20th. Petrov spoke fluent German and tried to negotiate proper treatment as a prisoner of war. Instead, Hans and his men tortured him for 3 days before killing him. Not for information. They had nothing to gain from torture, but because causing pain made them feel powerful again. Hans wrote about it with disturbing satisfaction. The Bolshevik officer finally broke today, begged for mercy, in perfect German. Interesting how quickly their arrogance disappears under pressure. Perhaps we are still the master race after all. This psychological pattern repeated across the Eastern Front. As SS units suffered military defeats, they compensated by escalating their crimes against civilians and prisoners. Unable to defeat the Red Army, they took revenge on anyone weaker. Unable to prove their superiority in battle, they proved it through atrocity. The winter of 1941 to 42 broke the German army. Over 800,000 casualties in 3 months. Entire divisions destroyed, experienced officers dead, elite units reduced to scattered remnants. The Wehrmacht never fully recovered from that winter. But the SS did recover. Not militarily, their losses were just as severe. But psychologically, they emerged from the winter with a new understanding of their role. They weren't invincible warriors. They were survivors. Men who would do anything, commit any atrocity, cross any moral boundary to avoid defeat. Hans Becker survived the winter. Of his original company of 200 men, maybe 30 lived to see spring. Hans was evacuated to Germany for medical treatment and psychological evaluation. The doctors found him physically recovered but mentally transformed. Subject shows no signs of combat fatigue or nervous breakdown, the medical report stated. Remarkably resilient given severe battlefield stress. Recommends immediate return to combat duty. What the doctors missed was that Hans's resilience came from the complete destruction of his moral sense. He had survived by becoming something that wasn't quite human anymore. Hans returned to the front in spring 1942 and served with distinction until 1944. He participated in countless atrocities, earned multiple decorations, and was eventually promoted to command his own company. His superiors praised his hardness and proper National Socialist attitude. What they were really praising was his complete moral collapse. After the war, Hans disappeared into the chaos of defeated Germany. He was never brought to trial, never faced justice for his crimes. He probably lived out his days as a quiet, respectable citizen. Maybe he ran a shop, raised a family, went to church on Sundays. His neighbors would never have suspected that the mild-mannered man next door had once tortured prisoners and executed his own comrades. This was the real horror of the Russian winter. Not the casualties, not the military defeat, but the psychological transformation it created. The SS had stopped being hunters and become prey. But instead of being destroyed by that transformation, they were perfected by it. Because prey that learns to survive will do anything to avoid becoming victims again. And Heinrich Himmler was about to give them the perfect opportunity to prove it. 1943. Hitler's running out of Germans to kill for him. So he makes the most desperate decision in military history. He asks his inferior enemies to volunteer. And the shocking thing? Hundreds of thousands said yes. The meeting that changed everything happened on August 7th, 1942. SS Obergruppenführer Gottlob Berger sat in Heinrich Himmler's office, sweating despite the Berlin winter. He was about to propose something so radical, so contrary to Nazi ideology, that it could get him shot for treason. But the alternative was watching the SS die from lack of recruits. Reichsführer, Berger began carefully, I have a solution to our manpower crisis. But you're not going to like it. Himmler looked up from his paperwork. The master of the SS had aged years in the past 12 months. Stalingrad was turning into a disaster. German casualties on the Eastern Front exceeded 1.6 million men. The army was refusing to release more recruits to the SS. And Himmler's dream of an elite racial army was dying in the Russian snow. Speak, Himmler said. We recruit from the occupied territories, Berger said quickly. Scandinavians, Dutch, Flemish. Men of good Germanic stock who understand the Bolshevik threat. Himmler stared at him for a long moment. The idea was insane. The SS was supposed to be the purest expression of German racial superiority. Now Berger was suggesting they dilute it with foreigners, people the Nazi Party had spent years calling inferior. But Himmler was also a pragmatist. He could see the numbers as clearly as anyone. Without fresh recruits, the SS would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 6 months. How many could we realistically expect? He asked. Berger had done his homework. Initial estimates suggest 50 to 60,000 volunteers from northwestern Europe. Perhaps another 100,000 from the east if we frame it as anti-communist liberation. And you believe they'll fight for us? Against their own people? Berger nodded confidently. Give them the right motivation, and they'll fight anyone. Himmler made the decision that would transform the SS from a German organization into an international army of fanatics. Proceed with the Nordic recruitment. Quietly, we'll see what kind of volunteers we attract. One of the first to answer the call was Peter van den Berg, a 23-year-old dock worker from Amsterdam. Peter had every reason to hate the Germans. They'd occupied his country, killed his friends, turned his hometown into an armed camp. So why did he volunteer to join the SS? The answer reveals everything about how desperation creates the impossible. Pieter's story began with hunger. By 1942, the German occupation had reduced Dutch food rations to starvation levels. Pieter was watching his mother waste away, his younger sister grow skeletal. When SS recruiters arrived in Amsterdam promising food, pay and purpose, Pieter listened. The recruitment pitch was brilliantly crafted. The Germans didn't present themselves as conquerors. They presented themselves as liberators. We're not fighting against Holland, the recruiter explained. We're fighting for Europe, against the Bolshevik hordes who want to destroy Christian civilization. The recruiter, SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Kruger, had been chosen specifically for his ability to manipulate vulnerable young men. He spoke fluent Dutch, understood local concerns, and knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. Look around you, Kruger told Peter and the other potential recruits. Your country is starving because Britain and America are blockading food shipments. They'd rather see Dutch children die than admit they're losing the war. It was a lie, but a convincing one to desperate young men. Then came the hook. Join the SS, and your family receives full German rations. Your mother eats. Your sister survives. All you have to do is fight the real enemy, communism. Pieter signed up that same day, not because he believed in Nazi ideology, but because he couldn't watch his family starve. The psychological manipulation was perfect. They'd created a situation where joining the SS felt like an act of love, not betrayal. At the SS training camp in Bavaria, Peter underwent the same brutal conditioning that had created Klaus Weber and Heinrich Springer, but with an additional layer, ideological conversion, designed specifically for foreign recruits. The instructors didn't try to make Peter hate his own country. Instead, they convinced him he was saving it. Holland and Germany are brother nations, they explained. We're fighting together against Jewish, Bolshevik imperialism that threatens all of Europe. They showed him propaganda films of Soviet atrocities, real footage of murdered civilians, burned churches, destroyed cities. The images were genuine, but the context was manipulated. This is what happens when communists win, the instructors explained. This is what we're preventing in Holland. Within 6 months, Pieter had been transformed from a reluctant volunteer into a fanatical SS soldier. He wrote home about his mission to save Europe from communist barbarism. He truly believed he was fighting for Holland's future. The psychological manipulation had been that complete. Pieter's story wasn't unique. Across occupied Europe, similar scenes were playing out. Young men joining the SS not out of political conviction, but out of desperation, hunger, and careful psychological manipulation. By the end of 1943, Berger's recruitment drive had exceeded all expectations. Over 100,000 foreign volunteers had joined the SS. Scandinavians, Dutch, Flemish, French, even some British fascists. The numbers were staggering. But the real shock came when Himmler looked at the overall statistics. Of the 910,000 men who would eventually serve in the SS, over 220,000 were foreign volunteers. Nearly 25%. The master race had become the minority in their own organization. The irony was lost on Heinrich Himmler, or if he noticed it, he buried it beneath layers of rationalization. These weren't inferior foreigners, he convinced himself. They were Germanic peoples returning to their racial homeland. Europeans awakening to their common destiny. Blood brothers in the fight against Jewish Bolshevik tyranny. But the reality was much simpler and more damning. The SS had become so desperate for manpower that they'd abandoned their core ideology. The organization dedicated to German racial purity was now majority foreign. The elite force designed to prove German superiority was kept alive by Dutch dock workers, French peasants, and Scandinavian farmers. Pieter van den Berg served with distinction in the Nordland Division until his death in the ruins of Berlin. His final letter home, never delivered, expressed pride in his service and confidence in ultimate victory. He died believing he had saved Europe from communism. In reality, he had been a victim of the most successful psychological manipulation campaign in military history. The Foreign Legion of Fascism had been born, not through ideology or racial destiny, but through desperation and lies. Heinrich Himmler had promised his followers a pure Germanic army. Instead, he'd created an international collection of the lost, the desperate, and the deceived. And the most tragic part? They would fight just as fanatically as any German SS soldier. Because when you've been convinced that your survival depends on victory, you'll do anything to win. Even die for people who despise you. Jacques was 17. French. His grandfather fought against Germany in World War I. His father was killed by Germans in 1940. So why was Jacques, wearing an SS uniform, dying in Hitler's bunker? The answer will break your heart. Jacques Doriot was born in 1927 in the industrial suburbs of Paris. His grandfather, Henry, had been a sergeant in the trenches at Verdun. His father, Marcel, died in the desperate defense of France in May 1940. By every measure, Jacques should have hated the Germans with every fibre of his being. Instead, on his 18th birthday, Jacques walked into a German recruitment office and volunteered for the Waffen SS. His story explains how the Nazis turned victims into volunteers, enemies into allies, and tragedy into propaganda. The transformation began with his father's death. Marcel Doriot had been a good man, factory foreman, union member, devoted family man. When the Germans invaded, Marcel joined the hastily formed French resistance around Paris. He was killed in a useless skirmish outside Meaux, shot down while trying to stop a German tank column with a rifle from 1870. Marcel's death left Jacques' mother, Marie, with 3 children and no income. The French government had collapsed. The social services that might have helped them no longer existed. Within months, the family was destitute. Marie found work in a German munitions factory, assembling artillery shells for 12 hours a day. The pay was barely enough to keep the family from starving. Jacques, as the oldest son, was expected to quit school and find work to supplement their income. At 13, he was cleaning floors in the same factory where his mother was building weapons for the army that had killed his father. The psychological damage was immediate and profound. Jacques was old enough to understand the contradiction, working for the enemy to survive, but too young to process the moral complexity. He dealt with it by compartmentalizing. The Germans weren't the enemy. They were just people. Sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, but ultimately just trying to survive like everyone else. This rationalization was exactly what German psychological warfare experts had predicted. Dr. Hans Frank, the Reich specialist in occupied population management, had written extensively about how to break down resistance among conquered peoples. Make them complicit in their own occupation, Frank advised. Force them to choose between principles and survival. Most will choose survival, and once they do, they'll rationalize their choice. Jacques rationalized brilliantly. By age 15, he had convinced himself that collaboration wasn't betrayal, it was pragmatism. France had lost the war. The old government was gone. The only practical choice was to make the best of the new reality. The final psychological breakthrough came when Jacques met SS Untersturmführer Karl Zimmermann. Zimmermann was a specialist in what the Germans called youth guidance, identifying promising young men in occupied territories and gradually converting them to the Nazi cause. Zimmermann didn't approach Jacques with Nazi propaganda. Instead, he approached him with sympathy. "Your father was a brave man," Zimmermann told Jacques. He died fighting for what he believed in. I respect that, even though we were enemies. This unexpected compassion from a German officer cracked something open in Jacques' psyche. For 3 years he'd been carrying rage and grief about his father's death. Now, for the first time, someone was acknowledging his pain, even if that someone was technically the enemy. Zimmermann was patient. He spent months building trust, offering small kindnesses, treating Jacques like a person rather than a conquered subject. He helped secure better working conditions for Marie at the factory. He arranged for Jacques' younger siblings to receive extra food rations. He positioned himself as a protector rather than an occupier. Only after establishing this relationship did Zimmermann begin the ideological conversion. But even then, he was subtle. He didn't attack French patriotism or praise German superiority. Instead, he focused on a larger enemy that threatened both France and Germany. "Your father died fighting Germans," Zimmermann explained. "But the real war isn't between France and Germany. It's between Christian Europe and communist barbarism." He showed Jacques propaganda about Soviet atrocities, communist persecution of Catholics, Bolshevik plans to destroy European civilization. "Imagine if the communists had won in 1940, Zimmermann continued. "Your father would still be dead, but your mother would be in a labor camp, your sisters would be in state orphanages, and you'd be mining coal in Siberia." It was manipulation, but it was also psychologically clever. Zimmermann was reframing the German occupation as salvation rather than conquest. The final hook was personal opportunity. "France needs leaders for the future," Zimmermann told Jacques. "Young men who understand the new Europe that's being born. Join the SS, prove yourself in battle against the real enemy, and you'll return home as a hero, ready to help rebuild France as an equal partner in the German sphere." Jacques was 17 when he finally accepted Zimmermann's offer. Not because he believed in Nazi ideology. He probably couldn't have explained Nazi racial theory if his life depended on it. But because he believed in the future Zimmermann had painted. A future where his sacrifice would give his family security, his country relevance, and himself purpose. Jacques joined the Charlemagne Division, the SS unit composed entirely of French volunteers. The name was chosen deliberately. Charlemagne had been the great unifier of Western Europe, the king who had united French and German lands under a single crown. The symbolism was perfect, French and German brothers fighting together against the barbaric East. The training was the same brutal conditioning that had created Klaus Weber and Peter van den Berg. But for French volunteers, there was an additional psychological element. They were constantly reminded that they were proving French worthiness, demonstrating that France deserved a place in the new European order. Jacques excelled in training. He was intelligent, physically strong, and motivated by a genuine desire to prove himself. His instructors praised his proper European spirit and marked him for rapid promotion. Within a year, Jacques was a squad leader in a frontline SS unit. His letters home during this period are heartbreaking to read. They're filled with genuine enthusiasm for his mission and absolute confidence in ultimate victory. "Dear Mother," he wrote in February 1944, "we are fighting the decisive battle for European civilization. The communists want to destroy everything our ancestors built. The cathedrals, the universities, the art, the music. We won't let them. France will be free and proud again because of what we're doing here. Jacques genuinely believed every word. The psychological conditioning had been that complete. He saw himself as a patriot, not a traitor. A defender of French culture, not a betrayer of French sovereignty. A hero fighting for his country's future, not a victim dying for his country's enemies. The Charlemagne Division first saw combat on the Eastern Front in early 1944. They fought with the fanaticism that only true believers can muster. Not because they were inherently violent, but because they were convinced their sacrifice was noble. Jacques participated in the defense of the Baltic states, the retreat through Poland, and finally the last stand in Berlin. At each stage, as the military situation became more hopeless, his determination grew stronger. Because admitting defeat meant admitting that everything he'd done, everyone he'd killed, all the suffering he'd endured, had been for nothing. His final letter was never sent. Found in his pocket after his death in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, it read, "Mother, if you receive this, know that I died for France. For the France that could have been. For the Europe our children will inherit. I have no regrets." Jacques Doriot died on May 1st, 1945, in the basement of a bombed-out building 3 blocks from Hitler's bunker. He was 19 years old. Soviet soldiers found his body clutching a German machine gun, surrounded by Russian corpses. He had fought to the end with the courage and dedication of a true believer. The tragedy isn't that Jacques died. The tragedy is that he died believing he was a hero, never understanding that he was a victim, never realizing that the people who had recruited him, trained him, and sent him to die had never intended to save France. They had intended to use France. And Jacques, like thousands of other young Frenchmen, had been the perfect tool for that use. From victim to volunteer to victim again. That was the French paradox in all its heartbreaking complexity. And Jacques Doriot was its perfect embodiment. They promised them a country. They delivered them slavery. And when 180,000 Ukrainian men realized they'd been betrayed, some did something that will shock you. Captain Dmytro Palienko stood at attention in the ruins of a French chateau, watching 1,200 of his Ukrainian SS soldiers surrender their weapons to French resistance fighters. It was September 21st, 1944. 6 months earlier, these same men had been fighting Soviet partisans in the forests of Belarus. Now they were defecting to the very allies they'd been trained to hate. How does an entire SS division switch sides in the middle of a war? The answer reveals the most cynical betrayal in Nazi recruitment history. Dmytro's journey to that moment began in 1918, when Ukraine briefly achieved independence after the Russian Revolution. For 7 months, Ukraine was a sovereign nation with its own government, army, and flag. Then the Bolsheviks returned, crushed the independence movement, and absorbed Ukraine into the Soviet Union. Dmytro was 5 years old when his country died. He spent the next 23 years dreaming of its resurrection. The dream became a nightmare during Stalin's collectivization campaign. From 1932 to 1933, Soviet policies deliberately starved Ukraine into submission. The Holodomor, death by hunger, killed between 3 and 7 million Ukrainians. Dmytro watched his grandparents waste away. He saw his neighbors resort to cannibalism. He learned to hate the Soviet system with every fiber of his being. When the Germans invaded in June 1941, Dmytro and hundreds of thousands of other Ukrainians saw them as liberators. Here, finally, was a power strong enough to break Soviet rule. A chance for Ukrainian independence after 2 decades of oppression. Dmytro was among the first to volunteer when the Germans began recruiting Ukrainian auxiliary forces. The German recruitment pitch was everything Ukrainian nationalists wanted to hear. SS Gruppenführer Hans Preutzmann, responsible for organizing Ukrainian formations, promised them their own state after victory. Ukraine will be free, Preutzmann declared at recruitment rallies. Free to govern itself, preserve its culture, and take its rightful place among European nations. Over 180,000 Ukrainians believed him. They formed police battalions, auxiliary units, and eventually the 14th SS Galician Division. More Ukrainians served in German forces than any other nationality except Germans themselves. They fought with desperate courage because they thought they were fighting for their homeland's freedom. Dmytro commanded a company in the Galician Division during their first major battle at Brody in July 1944. The division was supposed to stop a Soviet offensive that threatened to cut off German forces in western Ukraine. Instead, they were surrounded and nearly destroyed. Of 11,000 Ukrainian SS soldiers who entered the battle, fewer than 3,000 escaped. But the military defeat wasn't what broke Dmytro's faith in the German cause. It was what he discovered in the aftermath. While recovering in a German field hospital, Dmytro overheard a conversation between 2 SS officers. They were discussing post-war plans for Ukraine, and what Dmytro heard destroyed everything he'd believed about German intentions. The Ukrainians fight well enough, one officer was saying, but they're deluding themselves if they think we'll give them independence. Ukraine will be a German colony, nothing more. The Slavs can provide labor, but they'll never govern themselves. The other officer laughed. Preutzmann's promises were just recruitment propaganda. Once we've won, we'll decide who lives where and under what conditions. The Ukrainians can work German farms and mines. That's about all they're good for. Dmytro lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. The Germans had never intended to free Ukraine. They had intended to colonize it. Ukrainian SS soldiers weren't allies fighting for their homeland. They were colonial troops fighting to enslave their own people. The realization was devastating. Dmytro had spent 3 years killing Soviet soldiers, believing he was fighting for Ukrainian independence. In reality, he'd been fighting to replace Soviet tyranny with German tyranny. The blood on his hands had purchased nothing but a change of masters. Dmytro wasn't alone in his disillusionment. Across the remnants of the Galician Division, similar conversations were taking place. Ukrainian officers were comparing notes, sharing intelligence, and reaching the same horrifying conclusion. They had been used. The final straw came when the division was transferred to France for rest and refit. The Ukrainians expected to be sent back to fight the Soviets. Instead, they were ordered to conduct anti-partisan operations against French civilians. The same people who had promised them freedom were now ordering them to suppress someone else's freedom. Dmytro made his decision on September 15th, 1944. He would defect to the French resistance with as many of his men as would follow him. It was a desperate gamble, but anything was better than continuing to serve a cause that had betrayed everything he believed in. The approach to the French resistance was delicate. How do you convince people you've been fighting against that you want to join them? Dmytro sent a message through underground channels. We are Ukrainians who were deceived by German promises. We want to fight for freedom, real freedom, not German colonialism. The French were skeptical at first. These were SS soldiers after all, men who had been killing resistance fighters for months. But Dmytro proved his sincerity by providing detailed intelligence about German defensive positions. Information that cost German lives and saved French ones. On September 21st, Dmytro led 1,200 Ukrainian SS soldiers in a mass defection near Belfort. They brought their weapons, their vehicles, and their knowledge of German tactics. The French resistance, stunned by this unprecedented betrayal within SS ranks, accepted them into the forces of the interior. It was the only time in the war that an entire SS unit switched sides. The only time that Heinrich Himmler's supposedly fanatical soldiers chose conscience over orders. And it happened because the Ukrainians finally understood they'd been fighting for their own enslavement. The newly formed 1st Ukrainian Battalion fought alongside French forces for the remainder of the war. They participated in the liberation of Belfort, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final advance into Germany. Dmytro himself was awarded the Croix de Guerre for his leadership during the Battle of Colmar. But the victory was bittersweet. When the war ended, the Allies handed Ukraine back to the Soviet Union. The country Dmytro had fought to free remained enslaved. Stalin's revenge on Ukrainian collaborators was swift and merciless. Thousands were executed, tens of thousands sent to gulags. Dmytro never returned to Ukraine. He settled in France, where the government granted him citizenship in recognition of his service with the resistance. He lived quietly for the rest of his life, working as a mechanic, raising a family, never speaking publicly about his wartime experiences. But in his private papers, discovered after his death in 1987, Dmytro left a bitter assessment of his journey, from Soviet oppression to German betrayal to Allied victory. We fought for a dream that was always a lie. Independence was never on offer. Only a choice between different forms of slavery. The tragedy is that so many good men died believing otherwise. 180,000 Ukrainians had joined the German cause hoping to free their homeland. Instead, they'd participated in its continued enslavement. Most never lived to understand the full scope of their betrayal. Those who did, like Dmytro, carried the knowledge like a wound that never healed. They died for a dream that was always a lie. And the people who sold them that dream never intended anything else. Per was 20, blonde, blue-eyed, everything Himmler dreamed of. He volunteered from neutral Sweden to fight Bolshevism. 3 years later, he's bleeding out in a Berlin street, begging in Swedish for his mother. Per Eriksson's story should have been a Nazi propaganda masterpiece. Here was living proof of the Nordic ideal, a perfect Aryan specimen voluntarily joining the SS to defend European civilization. Instead, it became a tragedy that exposed the hollow core of Nazi racial theory. Per grew up in Malmö, just across the water from German-occupied Denmark. His family was comfortably middle class. His father owned a successful fishing business. His mother taught primary school. Sweden was neutral, prosperous, and peaceful. Per had no reason to leave any of that behind. But Per was 20 years old in 1942, and 20-year-olds don't always make rational decisions. He was bored with the safety of neutral Sweden, hungry for adventure, and susceptible to the romantic appeal of a great cause. When SS recruiters began operating quietly in Swedish universities, Per was exactly the kind of young man they were looking for. The recruitment was subtle and sophisticated. The Germans couldn't operate openly in neutral Sweden, so they worked through Swedish fascist organizations and pro-German student groups. The pitch wasn't join the Nazi party, it was defend Nordic civilization. Professor Erik Lundberg, a Swedish academic who had been secretly recruited by German intelligence, gave the lecture that changed Per's life. Speaking to a student group at Lund University, Lundberg painted a terrifying picture of the Bolshevik threat to Scandinavian culture. Stalin's armies are massing on our borders, Lundberg warned. If Germany falls, Sweden will be next. They'll destroy our churches, our universities, our way of life. The only thing standing between us and barbarism is the courage of young Nordic men willing to fight for their heritage. It was masterful propaganda. Lundberg wasn't asking Swedish students to betray their country. He was asking them to save it. Per and dozens of other young Swedes believed every word. The volunteers were smuggled across to Denmark in small groups, then transported to Germany for training. Per found himself at an SS facility in Bavaria, surrounded by young men from across Scandinavia. Danes, Norwegians, even a few Finns, all united in their determination to save Nordic civilization from communist destruction. The training was the same brutal conditioning that had created Klaus Weber and Jacques Doriot. But for Scandinavian volunteers, there was an additional element of racial indoctrination. They were constantly told they represented the purest expression of Aryan blood, the natural leaders of the German racial community. "You are not foreigners," SS instructors told them. "You are Germans who happen to be born outside the Reich. Your blood is our blood. Your destiny is our destiny." It was intoxicating for young men who had grown up in small, peripheral countries to be told they were members of a master race destined to rule Europe. Per excelled in training. He was physically strong, intellectually capable, and motivated by genuine belief in his mission. His instructors marked him for rapid promotion, and he graduated as an Unterscharführer, a sergeant, in the new Nordland Division. The Nordland Division was Heinrich Himmler's vision of the future SS made manifest. Germans, Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes fighting together as racial brothers. A preview of the unified Nordic Empire that would emerge after victory. Per was proud to be part of it. His first letter home, written from training camp in January 1943, bubbled with enthusiasm. Dear mother and father, you cannot imagine the sense of purpose I feel here. We are making history, defending everything our ancestors built. The camaraderie among Nordic volunteers is extraordinary. We truly are brothers in the deepest sense. I know you worry about my safety, but some things are worth any risk. Per's parents were horrified. Their son had abandoned a promising future in neutral Sweden to join the army of an enemy power. His father wrote desperate letters pleading with him to come home. His mother contacted Swedish authorities to see if they could intervene. But Per was 21 by then, legally an adult, and his decision was irreversible. The Nordland Division first saw combat in Croatia in spring 1943, fighting against Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans. For Per, it seemed like the perfect introduction to war, defending European civilization against communist insurgents in a picturesque Balkan setting. The reality was very different. The war in Yugoslavia was savage and brutalizing, with no clear front lines and no mercy for civilians. Per's unit participated in anti-partisan operations that were actually mass executions of suspected communist sympathizers, including women, children, and elderly civilians who had no connection to the resistance. Per's letters home stopped mentioning camaraderie and brotherhood. They became terse, formal reports on his health and location. I am well. Weather is warm. Operations continue successfully. What he couldn't write was that he was participating in atrocities that would have sickened his younger self. In November 1943, the Nordland Division was transferred to the Eastern Front. Per found himself in the frozen hell of the Leningrad siege, where Scandinavian volunteers were dying in their thousands for a cause that had nothing to do with defending their homelands. The winter of 1943 to 44 broke something inside Per. Like Hans Becker before him, he discovered that racial superiority meant nothing against Russian artillery. That Nordic blood froze just as easily as any other kind. That the master race could die of typhus and frostbite like anyone else. Per's final coherent letter was written in February 1944. I understand now that we were deceived. Not maliciously, perhaps, but completely. This is not a war for Nordic civilization. This is a war for German expansion. We are dying for someone else's empire, not our own heritage. But Per couldn't leave. Desertion from the SS meant execution, and even if he could escape, where would he go? Sweden would prosecute him as a traitor. He was trapped in a war that had stopped making sense, fighting for a cause he no longer believed in. The Nordland Division's casualties were staggering. Of the original 12,000 Scandinavian volunteers who had joined the unit, fewer than 2,000 were still alive by spring 1944. The survival rate was less than 20%. Per had watched most of his friends die in the Russian snow. The division's final battle came in Berlin in April 1945. By then, it was a skeleton force of maybe 800 men, fighting house to house against the Red Army. Per was wounded on April 28th, while defending a government building near the Reich Chancellery. Soviet medics found him 3 days later, delirious with fever and blood loss. He kept calling for his mother in Swedish, begging her to forgive him for leaving home. The medics couldn't understand the language, but they recognized the universal sound of a dying boy wanting his mother. Per died on May 2nd, 1945, in a Soviet field hospital. He was 23 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave with hundreds of other foreign SS volunteers. His parents never learned exactly where or when he died. The final irony is that Per's death accomplished nothing. Sweden remained neutral throughout the war and emerged prosperous and democratic. The Nordic civilization Per thought he was defending survived without his sacrifice. The Bolshevik invasion of Scandinavia never came, because it was never planned. Per Eriksson and thousands of other young Scandinavians died for a threat that existed only in German propaganda. They were perfect Aryans who discovered that perfection meant nothing. Master race members who died as slaves to someone else's ambition. Nordic brothers who found brotherhood only in shared graves in foreign soil. The bitter irony is that perfect Aryans died for imperfect dreams, and the people who recruited them never intended anything else. Picture this. It's 1944. Horse cavalry charging Soviet tanks. Sounds medieval, right? Except these aren't German horses. They're Cossack horses, ridden by men whose grandfathers fought against Germany. Leading them, a German general who speaks better Russian than German. This is the strangest story in the entire history of the Waffen SS. The story of how Heinrich Himmler recruited his most effective foreign fighters from the very people Nazi ideology declared subhuman. Colonel Pyotr Krasnov was 68 years old when he made the decision that would define his legacy. A veteran Cossack officer who had fought in the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and the Russian Civil War, Krasnov had more military experience than most German generals. He also had more reason to hate the Soviet Union than any man alive. The Cossacks were a warrior people who had served the Russian Tsars for centuries. Independent, proud, and fiercely traditional, they lived in self-governing communities along Russia's southern borders. They were the Tsar's cavalry, his frontier guards, his most reliable soldiers, until the Bolsheviks decided they were a threat to communist ideology. Between 1919 and 1921, the Soviet regime conducted what can only be called genocide against the Cossack people. Entire villages were massacred. Traditional leaders were executed. Children were forcibly separated from their families and sent to state orphanages where they were taught to hate their own heritage. The word Cossack was banned from official documents. Krasnov had fled to Western Europe after the Bolshevik victory, spending 20 years in exile dreaming of revenge. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, he saw his chance. Here was a power strong enough to destroy the communist regime that had murdered his people. Krasnov contacted German authorities and offered his services. The German response was initially skeptical. Cossacks were Slavs, classified by Nazi racial theory as subhuman. They couldn't possibly be trusted with weapons or significant military responsibility. But by 1942, German manpower needs were so desperate that even subhumans were starting to look useful. SS Obergruppenführer Gottlob Berger, the same man who had convinced Himmler to recruit Western Europeans, saw the potential in Krasnov's offer. The Cossacks were natural cavalry, perfect for anti-partisan operations in the vast territories behind the Eastern Front. They knew the terrain, spoke the language, and had every reason to hate the communist enemy. The first Cossack units were formed in late 1942 from Soviet prisoners of war and refugees. Small formations, maybe battalion size, used primarily for scouting and security duties. But their effectiveness quickly became apparent. These weren't reluctant collaborators or desperate volunteers. They were motivated by generations of hatred for the Soviet system. Captain Ivan Kononov was typical of the Cossack officers who joined the German cause. Born in 1911 in the Don region, he had grown up hearing stories of Bolshevik atrocities from survivors of the genocide. His grandfather had been executed by the Cheka. His father had been sent to a gulag and never returned. Ivan himself had been drafted into the Red Army, where he was constantly suspected of disloyalty because of his Cossack background. When Ivan's Red Army unit was surrounded by German forces in August 1941, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of fighting to the death, he surrendered. And when German officers asked if he would be willing to fight against the Soviet regime, Ivan said yes without hesitation. "They killed my people," Ivan later explained. "They destroyed our way of life. They turned us into strangers in our own land. The Germans, at least, offered us a chance for revenge." By 1943, Cossack formations had grown to division size. The 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps, under German command, included nearly 25,000 mounted warriors. They operated primarily in Yugoslavia, fighting Tito's communist partisans in terrain perfect for cavalry operations. The sight was surreal, horse cavalry in the age of tanks and aircraft. But in the mountainous terrain of the Balkans, horses were often more effective than motorized vehicles. The Cossacks could move quietly through forests, cross rivers where bridges had been destroyed, and operate in areas where fuel shortages had immobilized German armor. Ivan commanded a squadron in the savage fighting around Sarajevo in winter 1943. His men fought with a ferocity that impressed even veteran SS officers. Not because they believed in Nazi ideology. Most couldn't have explained racial theory if their lives depended on it. But because they were fighting for something deeper than politics. They were fighting for their identity, their culture, their right to exist as a people. The campaign in Yugoslavia was brutal and unforgiving. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides took few prisoners. Ivan's letters home, smuggled to relatives in Germany through underground networks, described the psychological toll of fighting an enemy who spoke his own language and shared his Orthodox faith. "We are killing Slavs to serve Germans," Ivan wrote, "fighting our own people for the chance to be free. Sometimes I wonder if we are any different from the Bolsheviks we hate. But then I remember what they did to our villages, our families, our traditions. And I know we have no choice." The moral complexity of the Cossack situation was unprecedented. These were people who had genuine grievances against the Soviet system. Victims of communist genocide who saw collaboration with Germany as their only path to survival. But they were also serving a regime that considered them racially inferior and had no intention of granting them independence. The illusion began to crack in late 1944 as German defeats mounted. Cossack officers started receiving disturbing reports about German plans for post-war Eastern Europe. Plans that envisioned them as agricultural laborers in a German colony, not as free people in their own homeland. Colonel Krasnov, now 71 and serving as nominal leader of all Cossack forces, tried to negotiate with German authorities for guarantees of post-war autonomy. The response was brutally honest. Cossacks are Slavs, SS officials told him. Slavs are servants, not rulers. You can serve the Reich faithfully and be treated well, but you will never govern yourselves. The betrayal was complete, but it was also too late to matter. By spring 1945, the Cossack units were trapped in Austria with nowhere to run. The Red Army was approaching from the east, determined to punish traitors. The Western Allies were approaching from the west, under orders to repatriate all Soviet citizens regardless of their wishes. Ivan Kononov's final letter was written on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. "Tomorrow the British will hand us over to Stalin's executioners," he wrote. "We fought for freedom and found only different forms of slavery. Perhaps our children will understand that we tried to preserve something worth preserving even if we failed." The repatriation was carried out with mechanical efficiency. British and American forces herded Cossack families into cattle cars for transport to the Soviet Union. Men, women, children, elderly, all were sent back to face Stalin's justice. Most were executed within weeks of arrival. Those who survived were sent to gulags in Siberia. Colonel Krasnov was hanged in Moscow's Lubyanka prison on January 16, 1947. His last words were reportedly, "I served the Cossack people, not the German Reich." History will judge whether that was a crime or a duty. Ivan Kononov died in a Soviet labor camp in 1952. His crime, according to his death certificate, was treason against the Soviet state. His real crime was believing that serving Germany might somehow save his people from communist oppression. The question that haunts historians is whether the Cossacks were freedom fighters or collaborators. The answer is that they were both and neither. They were victims of two totalitarian systems who tried to play one against the other and were destroyed by both. They were warriors without a country, fighting for a freedom that was never on offer. Were they freedom fighters or collaborators? Perhaps the more honest question is, what would you have done in their place? When your people have been murdered, your culture destroyed, your identity erased. When the choice is between serving your enemies or watching your heritage die completely. The Cossacks chose to fight for the chance to be free. They lost everything, but they died as Cossacks, not as Soviet citizens. In the end, that may have been the only victory available to them. July 5th, 1943. The largest tank battle in history is about to begin. Hitler's betting everything on his SS elite. But there's something he doesn't know. The Soviets have been waiting. Unterscharführer Wolfgang Müller sits in his Panzer IV, watching the sunrise over the Russian steppe. 24 years old, veteran of Poland and France, member of the elite Das Reich division. Wolfgang has never lost a battle. In exactly 6 hours, he'll be dead. Operation Citadel was supposed to be Germany's masterstroke. a massive pincer movement designed to crush the Soviet bulge around Kursk and restore German momentum on the Eastern Front. 2,700 tanks and assault guns. The largest concentration of armor in military history. Hitler's personal guarantee that this would end the war in the East. Wolfgang's crew had complete confidence in their mission. They were SS. They were elite. They had never been defeated. "We'll be in Moscow by Christmas," Wolfgang's gunner, Hans, joked as they performed final equipment checks. "Maybe we can send Stalin a Christmas card from the Kremlin." But what Wolfgang couldn't see from his tank was the trap that Marshal Georgy Zhukov had spent months preparing. 8 defensive belts stretching 175 kilometers deep. Over 40,000 mines per kilometer of front. 6,000 anti-tank guns waiting in carefully prepared positions. The Soviets weren't just defending. They were creating a killing field. At 4 a.m., the German artillery barrage began. The earth shook for 30 minutes as shells pounded Soviet positions. Wolfgang could feel the concussions through his tank's armor. "That should soften them up," Hans commented. He was wrong. The Soviet defenses had been designed to survive German artillery. Deep bunkers, dispersed positions, overlapping fields of fire. When the barrage lifted and German tanks began their advance, they rolled directly into the most sophisticated killing ground ever constructed. Wolfgang's first hint that something was wrong came at 0630. His company was advancing across what appeared to be empty farmland when the lead tank simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was a column of black smoke and twisted metal. Anti-tank mine. The first of many. "Jesus Christ," Hans whispered over the intercom. "Did you see that?" Wolfgang had seen it. He'd also seen the muzzle flashes from concealed anti-tank guns beginning to wink from positions that were supposed to have been destroyed by the artillery. The Soviets weren't softened up. They were waiting. What followed was 8 hours of mechanical slaughter. German tanks advanced into prepared kill zones, where every approach was covered by multiple weapons. Soviet anti-tank guns, hidden in camouflaged positions, picked off German armor at ranges where return fire was impossible. The much-vaunted German tactical superiority meant nothing against an enemy who had chosen the ground and prepared it perfectly. Wolfgang's tank made it perhaps 3 kilometers before disaster struck. An 88mm anti-tank round punched through their frontal armor at 1 p.m., killing Hans instantly and wounding the driver. Wolfgang tried to back out of the kill zone, but the tank's transmission had been damaged. They were stuck in the open, under fire, with nowhere to run. "We have to abandon," Wolfgang told his remaining crew members. But leaving the tank meant crossing 50 meters of open ground under direct fire from Soviet positions. Wolfgang made the decision that would haunt his final moments. "We fight from here until the ammunition runs out." For the next hour, Wolfgang's crew fought a losing battle against an invisible enemy. They fired at muzzle flashes, at suspected positions, at anything that might be hiding Soviet anti-tank guns. But they were silhouetted against the sky, while their enemies were concealed in prepared positions. It was a slaughter. Wolfgang's final diary entry was found in the wreckage of his tank. "The Russians have learned. They're not running anymore. They're fighting like we used to fight." with intelligence, preparation, and cold determination. We're not the master race anymore. We're just men. And men can die. Wolfgang was killed by sniper fire at 3:15 p.m. while trying to repair his tank's radio. His crew held their position for another 30 minutes before Soviet infantry overran them. None survived. Across the Kursk battlefield, similar scenes were playing out. The elite SS Panzer Corps, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, were being systematically destroyed by an enemy they had considered inferior. The Germans gained perhaps 12 kilometers in 3 days of fighting, at a cost that bankrupted their entire strategic reserve. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These were troops who had conquered Poland in 18 days, France in 6 weeks, and half of Russia in 6 months. Now they were being stopped, surrounded, and slaughtered by the same Red Army they had scattered in 1941. SS Oberfuhrer Theodor Wisch, commanding the Leibstandarte Division, recorded his impressions on July 8th. The enemy has changed. No longer the panicked peasants we faced 2 years ago. These are professional soldiers with excellent equipment and superior defensive positions. Our casualties are unsustainable. Morale is cracking for the first time since the war began. By July 12th, the German offensive had stalled completely. Instead of the breakthrough that would restore German fortunes, Kursk had become a meat grinder that was consuming Germany's last strategic reserves. Hitler, faced with the collapse of his master plan, made the decision that sealed Germany's fate. He called off the offensive. The retreat began on July 13th. But the Soviets weren't finished. As German forces pulled back, Zhukov launched his own offensive, a massive counterattack designed to destroy what remained of German armor on the Eastern Front. The hunters had become the hunted. SS Untersturmführer Klaus Fischer was part of the German rear guard during the retreat. His account captures the psychological collapse that followed Kursk. We're running. The SS is running. From Russians. Everything we believed about ourselves, about our superiority, about our destiny, it's all lies. We're not supermen. We're just frightened boys pretending to be warriors. Kursk cost Germany over 50,000 casualties and 800 tanks. Losses that could never be replaced. But the real damage wasn't material. It was psychological. The myth of SS invincibility had died in the Russian mud. For the first time since the war began, SS soldiers knew they were going to lose. After Kursk, they knew they were going to lose. The only question was how many would die before the end came. June 6th, 1944. The Hitler Youth Division, average age 18, is about to face battle-hardened Canadian veterans. It's not going to be a fair fight, but not in the way you think. Unterscharführer Peter Hansmann was 17 when he landed in Normandy. Born in Munich, raised in the Hitler Youth, volunteer for the Waffen SS on his 18th birthday. Peter represented everything Heinrich Himmler had dreamed of: pure German blood, perfect physical specimen, fanatical loyalty to the Reich. He would be dead within 72 hours of the Allied landing. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth was stationed near Caen when the invasion began. 20,000 of Germany's most promising young men, equipped with the latest tanks and weapons, trained to the highest SS standards. They were supposed to throw the invaders back into the sea within hours. Instead, they walked into a meat grinder that would destroy them completely. Peter's first glimpse of the invasion came at dawn on June 6th. From his position in a Norman village, he could see the English Channel filled with ships. Hundreds of ships. Maybe thousands. "Mein Gott," he whispered to his squad mate, Franz. "Look at them all." Franz, also 17, tried to maintain SS bravado. "Doesn't matter how many ships they have," he said. "Once we counterattack, they'll run back to England like they did at Dunkirk." But Peter could hear the uncertainty in Franz's voice. This wasn't what they'd been promised. The Hitler Youth Division's first action came on June 7th, when they were ordered to recapture the village of Orthy from Canadian forces. Peter's company advanced with the confidence of troops who had never been defeated. They expected to face demoralized conscripts who would break at the first sign of SS determination. Instead, they met the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. The Canadians had been fighting since Sicily. They were veterans, professionals, men who knew exactly what they were doing. When the teenage SS soldiers advanced across the Norman fields, the Canadians let them come. Then they opened fire with everything they had. Peter's first taste of real combat lasted exactly 4 minutes. His squad of 12 men advanced across an open field toward what appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse. Canadian machine gunners, hidden in carefully prepared positions, waited until the Germans were in the open. Then they cut them down like wheat. Within seconds, half of Peter's squad was dead or wounded. Franz took a burst of machine gun fire that nearly cut him in half. Peter dove into a shell crater and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. The SS were supposed to be superior. The enemy was supposed to run. Instead, Peter found himself pinned down by professional soldiers who showed no sign of intimidation. Canadian artillery began falling around his position with mechanical precision. Mortars, machine guns, rifle fire, all directed by men who knew their business. Peter realized with growing horror that he was outmatched. "We need to fall back," Peter shouted to his surviving squad members. But falling back meant crossing 200 meters of open ground under direct fire. The same ground that had just killed half his friends. Peter made the decision that would define his final hours. He decided to surrender. But surrendering to the Canadians proved impossible. Word had already spread about SS executions of Canadian prisoners earlier that morning. When Peter tried to approach Canadian lines with his hands up, a sniper's bullet took off the top of his head. The Canadians weren't taking SS prisoners anymore. Peter's experience was typical of the Hitler Youth Division's first encounter with Allied forces. These weren't the demoralized conscripts Nazi propaganda had promised. They were professional soldiers with superior equipment, air support, and unlimited artillery. The teenage SS soldiers, for all their training and fanaticism, were children fighting adults. The casualty figures tell the story. In the first week of fighting, the Hitler Youth Division lost over 40% of its strength. Not to cowardice or poor morale, but to simple military reality. Elite training means nothing when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with complete air superiority. SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, recorded his shock at the division's losses. These boys are fighting with the courage of lions. But courage cannot stop artillery shells or aircraft bombs. We are losing a generation of Germany's finest young men. And for what? A few kilometers of Norman farmland that we'll lose again tomorrow. The moral complexity of the Hitler Youth Division's destruction cannot be ignored. These were children, some as young as 16, who had been systematically brainwashed and militarized. They committed war crimes, executing prisoners and murdering civilians. But they were also victims of a system that had stolen their childhood and sent them to die for a lost cause. Canadian war correspondent Ross Munro witnessed the aftermath of one Hitler Youth attack. The field was covered with bodies of German soldiers. Boys, really. Some looked like they should have been in high school, not lying dead in a Norman pasture. It was horrifying and heartbreaking at the same time. These kids had been turned into fanatics, but they were still kids. The Hitler Youth Division's final major action came on June 26th, when they attempted to retake the village of Schur. By then, the division was a hollow shell, maybe 3,000 effective troops out of an original 20,000. But they attacked anyway, because surrender wasn't an option for SS soldiers. The attack failed within hours. Canadian defenders, now well established in prepared positions, systematically destroyed the attacking SS forces. The Hitler Youth Division ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. Its survivors were absorbed into other formations or sent to the rear for rest and refit that would never come. Unterscharführer Hans Weber was one of the few survivors. His final letter home, written from a field hospital in July 1944, captured the division's destruction. We came to Normandy as Hitler's elite. We believed we were the best soldiers in the world. Now I know we were just children playing at war. The enemy was everything we pretended to be: professional, disciplined, effective. We were brave, but bravery isn't enough when you're fighting the future. Normandy was where the future came to kill the past, where Allied industrial might, tactical competence, and technological superiority met Nazi fanaticism and found it wanting. The Hitler Youth Division had been the pride of the SS, the perfect expression of Nazi ideology in military form. Its destruction in the Norman hedgerows marked the beginning of the end for Heinrich Himmler's empire. The children warriors of the SS had met their match, and they had been found wanting. March 1945. The Red Army is 60 miles from Berlin. So naturally, Hitler sends his last reserves to Hungary to recapture oil fields for a country that will surrender in 8 weeks. The stupidity is breathtaking. SS Oberführer Sepp Dietrich stood in the ruins of a Hungarian farmhouse, staring at the radio message that would destroy his faith in Adolf Hitler forever. The orders were clear. His 6th SS Panzer Army, the last mobile reserve in the German arsenal, was to attack toward Budapest to recapture Hungarian oil fields. While Berlin burned and the Reich crumbled, Dietrich had served Hitler faithfully for over 20 years. He'd been there at the beer hall putsch, survived the Night of the Long Knives, conquered half of Europe. He'd never questioned an order from the Führer. Until now. "This is madness," Dietrich told his chief of staff. "The Soviets are preparing to assault Berlin, and we're sending our last reserves to capture oil fields we can't hold." But orders were orders, and Dietrich was still an SS officer. He would obey, even though he knew it was suicide. The 6th SS Panzer Army was everything that remained of Heinrich Himmler's dream. 4 elite SS divisions, Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Hitlerjugend, and Hohenstaufen. Veterans of Poland, France, Russia, and Normandy. The last remnant of the force that had once terrorized Europe. Panzer Commander Klaus Richter led his Tiger tank into the attack on March 6, 1945. 26 years old, Knight's Cross winner, veteran of every major tank battle since Kursk. Klaus knew this offensive was hopeless. But he also knew that retreat meant facing Soviet justice for 3 years of war crimes on the Eastern Front. The Hungarian offensive was doomed from the start. Soviet Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin had prepared deep defensive positions anchored on the Danube River. 3 defensive belts, over 5,000 anti-tank guns, and 400,000 men who had been fighting Germans since Stalingrad. They were ready. Klaus's first hint of disaster came when his tank got stuck in the Hungarian mud on the 2nd day of the offensive. Spring thaw had turned the ground into a quagmire that swallowed German armor. Dozens of tanks and assault guns simply sank up to their turrets, including 15 precious Tiger II tanks that represented months of German production. "We're sitting ducks," Klaus radioed to his company commander. Soviet artillery had zeroed in on the stuck German vehicles and was systematically destroying them. Klaus watched million-dollar tanks being turned into scrap metal. Equipment that could have defended Berlin was dying in Hungarian mud for no strategic purpose. The offensive lasted exactly 10 days. 10 days of futile attacks against prepared Soviet positions. 10 days of watching Germany's last reserves bleed to death. By March 16th, Dietrich's forces had gained maybe 15 kilometers and lost over 600 tanks and assault guns. Half of Germany's remaining armored strength. Then the Soviets counterattacked, and what had been a failed offensive became a complete catastrophe. Klaus's Tiger was overrun on March 20th during the Soviet push toward Vienna. His crew fought to the end, destroying 3 Soviet tanks before a 34 got close enough for a killing shot. Klaus died, believing he was defending German soil. He was actually defending Hungarian mud that would be in Soviet hands within hours. The retreat became a rout. Soviet forces smashed through German lines and advanced over 100 kilometers in 5 days. The 6th SS Panzer Army, once the terror of Europe, was scattered to the winds. Some units made it back to Austria. Most didn't. Hitler's response to the defeat was characteristic. Instead of accepting responsibility for the disaster, he blamed his most loyal soldiers. On March 27th, he issued an order that would destroy the last bond between the Führer and his SS elite. The order was delivered to Dietrich by radio, the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, and Hitlerjugend divisions have failed to fulfill their duty. They are to remove their armbands immediately as a mark of the Führer's displeasure. Dietrich stared at the message for a full minute. Hitler was ordering the SS to surrender their unit honors. The same men who had bled for him on a dozen battlefields were being publicly humiliated for following orders that any military professional could have told him were impossible. Dietrich gathered his surviving divisional commanders in a bombed-out Austrian farmhouse. He threw the radio message on the table and looked at men who had followed him from the beer halls of Munich to the gates of Moscow. "There's your reward for 5 years of loyalty," Dietrich said quietly. His voice was calm, but every man in the room could hear the rage underneath. "The Führer wants us to remove our armbands. Because we couldn't perform miracles with equipment he refused to give us, against odds he refused to acknowledge." SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the Leibstandarte, spoke for every man in the room. "We've followed every order, fought every battle he's asked us to fight. And this is how he repays us." Dietrich made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He refused to pass the order to his troops. "My men have earned their honors with blood," he told his staff. No political functionary, not even Hitler, can take that away from them. But the damage was done. Word of Hitler's order spread through the SS ranks like wildfire. Men who had worshipped the Führer began to understand that their loyalty had never been reciprocated, that they were expendable tools, not honored comrades. The Hungarian disaster destroyed more than tanks and men. It destroyed the mystical bond between Hitler and his SS elite. For the first time, SS soldiers began to question not just their orders but their cause. The man they had followed into hell had abandoned them when they needed him most. Legend claims that some SS veterans sent their decorations back to Hitler with bitter notes. Whether true or not, the sentiment was real. They'd been abandoned by their God. And gods who abandon their followers don't deserve worship. The final realization was devastating. They'd been abandoned by their God, and there was nowhere left to run. April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler has just put a gun in his mouth. Upstairs, in the ruins of Berlin, French teenagers are fighting Russian veterans with Panzerfausts. This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper from foreign boys who should have been home. Henri Fenet was 19 when he made his last stand in the rubble of the Reich Chancellery. Born in Lyon, orphaned at 12, recruited into the SS Charlemagne division at 17. Henri had travelled 1,000 miles to die for a man who despised the French. And he was about to die believing he was a hero. The defence of Berlin was the ultimate expression of Heinrich Himmler's International Legion. French boys from Charlemagne, Scandinavian volunteers from Nordland, Dutch and Belgian remnants from the Netherlands and Wallonia divisions. Even a handful of British fascists who had somehow survived 3 years of war. Foreign fanatics dying for a German dream that had become a nightmare. Henri's journey to Berlin had begun in the horror of the Eastern Front. The Charlemagne division had been all but destroyed fighting in Pomerania during the final Soviet offensive. Of the original 7,000 French volunteers, maybe 300 had made it to Berlin. The survivors were the hardest of the hard, men who had lost everything and had nothing left but their weapons and their hate. SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg commanded what remained of the foreign SS volunteers in Berlin. A veteran of the Eastern Front, Krukenberg had watched the SS transform from elite German formation to desperate international army. Now he commanded French teenagers, Norwegian laborers, and Dutch deserters in the final battle for Hitler's capital. They're the only real soldiers left, Krukenberg told Wilhelm Mohnke, overall commander of the Berlin defense. The German troops are finished. Old men and children who just want to surrender to the Americans. But these foreign volunteers? They have nowhere else to go. They'll fight to the end because the end is all they have left. Henri's position was in the basement of a bombed-out ministry building 3 blocks from Hitler's bunker. His squad, 6 French volunteers and 2 Norwegian SS men, had been ordered to hold the position against Soviet infantry advancing from the east. They had enough ammunition for maybe an hour of fighting. No resupply was coming. No reinforcements were available. They were on their own. The Soviet assault began at dawn on May 1st. Tanks, artillery, aircraft, everything the Red Army could bring to bear on the last few blocks of Nazi resistance. Henri watched through his rifle scope as 34 tanks rumbled down the street, their treads crushing the rubble of what had once been the most powerful city in Europe. Behind the tanks came Soviet infantry. Seasoned veterans who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin. Men who had seen their country invaded, their cities destroyed, their families murdered. They weren't taking prisoners anymore, especially not SS prisoners. Henri's first kill was a Soviet sergeant who made the mistake of exposing himself while directing his squad's advance. Henri's rifle shot took the man in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed in the street. "Got him," Henri whispered to his squad mate, Pierre. Pierre didn't respond. A Soviet sniper had already put a bullet through his head. The building changed hands 3 times in the next hour. Soviet infantry would fight their way to the upper floors, only to be driven back by desperate SS counterattacks. Henri and his surviving comrades fought room by room, floor by floor, using grenades and rifle fire to hold positions that had no strategic value. They were fighting because fighting was all they knew how to do. By noon, Henri was alone. His squad was dead, his ammunition was nearly exhausted, and Soviet voices could be heard in the corridor outside his position. He had maybe 6 bullets left in his rifle and 2 grenades clipped to his belt. Enough to kill a few more Russians before they killed him. Henri's final act was to scrawl a message on the wall of his basement hideout. Here died Henri Fenet, volunteer of the Charlemagne Division, age 19. I fought for Europe against Bolshevism. I regret nothing. Then he pulled the pins on both grenades and waited for the Soviets to find him. The explosion that killed Henri also killed 3 Soviet soldiers and wounded 2 others. It was a meaningless tactical victory in a meaningless battle for a meaningless building. But Henri died, believing it mattered, that his sacrifice meant something, that he was a hero defending civilization from barbarism. Similar scenes were playing out across the ruins of Berlin. Nordic volunteers from the SS Nordland Division fighting Soviet tank crews in hand-to-hand combat. Dutch SS men using Panzerfausts to destroy 34 tanks from point-blank range. Belgian Walloons dying in the ruins of the Reichstag while calling for their mothers in French. SS Brigadeführer Joachim Ziegler commanded the Nordland Division's final battle at the Anhalter Bahnhof. His force consisted of maybe 400 men, Danes, Norwegians, a few surviving Germans, and even some Latvian volunteers who had somehow made it to Berlin. They held the railway station for 6 hours against overwhelming Soviet forces. When the position was finally overrun, Ziegler was found dead at his command post, surrounded by the bodies of a dozen Soviet soldiers. The foreign volunteers fought with a fanaticism that amazed even battle-hardened Soviet veterans. Red Army Colonel Ivan Sidorov later wrote, "We expected the Germans to surrender once Hitler was dead. Instead, we found ourselves fighting Frenchmen, Norwegians, Dutchmen, boys who spoke languages we couldn't understand, but who fought like demons. They knew they were going to die, but they kept fighting anyway. It was brave and pointless and heartbreaking all at the same time." The end came on May 2nd, when the last SS positions in Berlin were finally overrun. Wilhelm Mohnke, the final commander of the Berlin garrison, attempted to break out with his remaining troops. Most were killed or captured within hours. The few who escaped faced an uncertain future in a Germany that no longer existed. Among the final defenders was Miguel Ezquerra, a Spanish volunteer who had fought with the Blue Division on the Eastern Front before joining the SS. Ezquerra somehow managed to escape Berlin and make his way back to Spain, where he lived quietly for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, published decades later, he wrote, "We died for nothing, for a dream that was always a lie. But we died as soldiers, fighting to the end. That has to count for something." But perhaps the most poignant story belongs to the unknown soldiers, the foreign volunteers whose names were never recorded, whose families never learned their fate. Boys who had travelled from across Europe to die in the ruins of a foreign capital, who called for their mothers in a dozen different languages as they bled out in German rubble. Soviet photographer Yevgeny Kaldey captured the aftermath in a famous photograph, the bodies of young men in SS uniforms scattered around the burned-out Reichstag. French faces, Scandinavian features, Slavic cheekbones. An international collection of the dead. The final harvest of Heinrich Himmler's recruitment drive. The silence after the shooting stopped was profound. No more artillery. No more machine gun fire. No more desperate voices calling in foreign languages for help that would never come. Just silence. And the sound of the wind blowing through the ruins of what had once been the capital of the 1,000-year Reich. Foreign volunteers dying for a dead dream. Boys calling for their mothers in different languages. The silence after the shooting stopped. This is how Heinrich Himmler's empire ended. Not with the triumph of the master race, but with the whimpering of abandoned children in a foreign grave. So, what were they really? After 3 hours, nearly 1 million lives, and 15 countries worth of tragedy, what's the answer to our question? Remember where we started. A 17-year-old French kid named Jacques, bleeding out in Berlin rubble. A Swedish boy dying for threats that never existed. Foreign volunteers from 15 nations calling for their mothers in different languages while defending a bunker that belonged to a man who despised them. Here's what they really were. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices for ordinary reasons. Heinrich Himmler wasn't born evil. He was a failed chicken farmer desperate for purpose. Klaus Weber wasn't a natural killer. He was a young officer following orders he thought were legal. Jacques Doriot wasn't a traitor. He was a hungry orphan, seduced by promises of meaning. Per Eriksson wasn't a Nazi. He was a bored college student who wanted adventure. They were farmers and students and factory workers and teachers. Fathers and sons and brothers who got swept up in something bigger than themselves. People who were promised belonging, purpose, specialness, and were willing to trade their humanity to get it. The terrifying truth is this: they weren't monsters when they started. They were made into monsters. Through systematic psychological manipulation, through promises that fed their deepest needs, through a process that turned normal human desires into weapons of mass destruction. The victims of the SS weren't just the millions who died in camps and villages and battlefields. The victims were also the young men who were seduced, manipulated, and transformed into killers. Klaus Weber was a victim. Jacques Doriot was a victim. Even Heinrich Himmler, in his pathetic way, was a victim. That doesn't excuse what they did. Victimhood doesn't erase responsibility. But understanding how ordinary people become extraordinary killers is the only way to prevent it from happening again. Because here's the lesson that should keep you awake at night. This could happen again. In fact, it is happening again. Right now, somewhere in the world, recruiters are identifying vulnerable young men, promising them purpose, belonging, the chance to be special, teaching them to dehumanize their enemies, creating new generations of fanatics who will kill and die for causes that serve other people's power. The methods change. Social media instead of rallies, online forums instead of beer halls. But the psychology remains the same. Find people who feel lost, abandoned, powerless. Give them someone to blame. Promise them they're part of something historically important. Then point them at your enemies and let them destroy themselves in service to your ambition. The most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is that we're different, that we're smarter, more moral, more resistant to manipulation than the people who joined the SS. That somehow, if we'd been born in 1920 Germany, we would have been the heroes, not the victims or the perpetrators. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Most people, under the right conditions, with the right pressures, will do terrible things. Will follow orders they know are wrong. Will rationalize cruelty as necessity. Will trade their conscience for belonging. That's what the Waffen SS really were. A million-person case study in how ideology weaponizes human nature. How promises of meaning and belonging can turn ordinary people into instruments of genocide. How the very human need to be special, to matter, to belong to something greater, can be twisted into the engine of mass murder. They were us. That's the terrifying truth. They were farmers and students and fathers and sons who got seduced by a promise of meaning, of belonging, of being special. And when we forget that, when we think we're different, when we think we're immune, that's when we become most vulnerable to our own night of long knives. The only defense against becoming them is remembering that we could. The only protection against manipulation is understanding how manipulation works. The only way to honor their victims is to refuse to become their successors. Remember Jacques bleeding out in Berlin, calling for his mother in French. Remember that he died believing he was a hero. And ask yourself, what promises would make you travel 1,000 miles to die for strangers who despise you? Because somewhere, someone is making those promises right now. And they're looking for people just like you,